A single flea bite unleashed a darkness that swallowed continents, leaving fields untended and cities echoing with silence. How could one invisible enemy kill up to 200 million people and reshape the very foundations of our world? A single cough echoed in the salty air of the Mediterranean port, a sound so ordinary that no one thought twice about it. The harbour bustled with the usual cries of merchants, the creak of ships heavy with grain, and the shouts of dockhands hauling barrels under the unforgiving sun, yet hidden in the folds of a sailor's cloak or beneath the fur of a rat scurrying down a mooring rope. An unseen terror was about to slip ashore. Within days, it would spread from household to household, from alley to marketplace, until the air itself seemed heavy with dread. Markets that once overflowed with colour and noise would fall silent. Bells would toll without rest. Priests would hurry from door to door, administering last rites until exhaustion overcame them. This was not the end of one city or one kingdom. It was the opening chapter in a catastrophe that would darken continents. The 14th century had not prepared humankind for what was coming. Across Eurasia and North Africa, societies were already balancing precariously on the edge of famine, war, and fragile prosperity. Populations had swelled after centuries of agricultural expansion, pressing the limits of what land and harvest could sustain. Trade routes tied distant civilizations together more tightly than ever before, carrying spices, silks, and silver between the ports of the Mediterranean, the oases of Central Asia, and the courts of China. Yet with that prosperity came vulnerability. The same arteries that enriched kingdoms also served as channels for disease, accelerating its reach far beyond what any community could imagine. At the heart of this unfolding nightmare was something invisible to the naked eye, something smaller than a grain of dust, yet infinitely more destructive. The bacterium Yersinia pestis dwelled in the blood of rodents, carried in the bites of fleas, and waited silently for the chance to leap across species. For millennia, it had smouldered in remote reservoirs, occasionally flaring into localized outbreaks that burned themselves out before spreading too far. But in the mid-1300s, shifts in climate and ecology combined with the vast web of human commerce to release it with unprecedented force. What had once been the curse of isolated communities would now become the deadliest plague in history. The scale of mortality defies comprehension. By the time the first wave burned itself out, entire villages had vanished from the map. Cities that had taken generations to build were hollowed out in weeks. Chroniclers struggled to find words to capture the devastation. In Florence, Giovanni Boccaccio wrote of empty streets and corpses stacked like firewood. In Cairo, Ibn Khaldun mourned that a whole generation of scholars and leaders had been cut off in its prime. In London, the sound of carts piled high with bodies became part of the daily rhythm of survival. Across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, up to 200 million people perished a collapse so vast that demographers still debate the full toll, knowing only that it reshaped the very structure of human society. The plague did more than kill. It rewrote economies, transformed faith, and unsettled political orders. Labour shortages cracked the foundations of feudalism, giving peasants leverage they had never before possessed. Entire religious institutions, shaken by their inability to protect the faithful, faced new scrutiny and dissent. Families that had survived the first onslaught found themselves living in a quieter, emptier world, where inheritance passed suddenly from uncle to nephew, and half of a village's fields lay untended. Even the landscape itself seemed changed, as abandoned farms reverted to forest, and once busy roads fell into silence. To live in the shadow of the plague was to exist in a world where certainty had evaporated. Death could arrive in the swelling of a lymph node, in the bloody cough of a neighbour, or in the fever that claimed a child overnight. Fear stripped away the rhythms of ordinary life. Weddings were cancelled, festivals abandoned, and markets deserted. Communities responded with desperate creativity. Some turned to elaborate processions of penitence. Others lashed out in violence against scapegoated minorities, while still others clung stubbornly to rituals of care, digging mass graves and ringing bells to remind the living of their mortality. Yet, out of this crucible of suffering came transformation. The very horror that threatened to annihilate societies forced them to adapt in ways that would echo for centuries. New public health measures were born. Quarantines, pest houses, and systems of surveillance that prefigured the powers of the modern state. Medical practice, though still bound to theories of humours and miasma, began to take halting steps toward observation and systematization. Literature, art, and memory themselves were reshaped, suffused with an awareness of fragility and the omnipresence of death. The story of the deadliest plague is not just a chronicle of mortality, but a portrait of humanity under extreme pressure. It is the story of how an invisible pathogen threaded its way along the trade routes of empires, and how men and women, in their millions, faced the collapse of the familiar with terror, resilience, cruelty, and ingenuity. It is the story of how a disease, with no consciousness of its own, became a shaper of history, toppling dynasties, redrawing economies, and forcing faiths to confront their own limits. As tolling bells echoed across cities from Messina to Samarkand, and as burial grounds expanded into fields and pastures, the world entered a new age. The plague was not merely a disaster. It was a pivot point, a reordering of human civilization. Out of the silence of emptied streets and the grief of mass graves would emerge new societies, carrying scars that would never fully heal, but also new possibilities that would redefine what it meant to live together. This is the story of how death on an unimaginable scale became one of history's most transformative forces. In the desolate grasslands of Central Asia, where horizons stretch unbroken and the winds whistle across endless steppe, the seeds of catastrophe lay hidden in the fur of small, burrowing creatures. Marmots, gerbils, and ground squirrels darted between burrows, their lives seemingly insignificant against the sweep of history. Yet within their blood, a bacterium lay dormant, ancient and deadly. Yersinia pestis had haunted these lands for centuries, surviving quietly in a delicate balance between rodents and fleas, an ecosystem of infection that rarely spilled into the wider world. The animals lived, died, and passed the pathogen from one generation to the next. Only occasionally would outbreaks flare, killing colonies of marmots or decimating populations of small rodents before retreating once more into silence. But when environmental shifts disturbed this equilibrium, when climate cooled or drought drove animals into new territories, the balance snapped. The steppe became a powder keg, and the plague, the spark waiting to ignite. The relationship between parasite, host, and climate was a complex dance. Fleas thrived in warm, damp seasons, clinging to the skins of their hosts, piercing flesh with needle-like mouths, and drinking deep. When their rodent carriers sickened and died, starving fleas leapt desperately to new victims, seeking another vein to pierce. Marmots, with their dense colonies and close-knit habits, offered the perfect incubator. A single infected flea could trigger a chain reaction, spreading through entire burrows until the ground itself seemed to quiver with death. Sometimes the outbreak would burn itself out with the extinction of a colony. Other times, the infection leapt outward, riding on the backs of new hosts, black rats, gerbils, or humans who hunted marmots for their fur and meat. The 14th century provided the perfect storm. Climatic upheavals swept across Eurasia. Harsh winters, unpredictable rainfall, and sudden shifts in temperature disrupted traditional cycles. Scholars now suspect that such instability drove rodents from their natural habitats, forcing them into closer contact with human settlements and trade routes. As pastures withered, herders expanded their range, their animals brushing against plague reservoirs in the wild. Hunters, in search of fur and food, exposed themselves to infected carcasses, unwittingly prying open the gates that separated animal sickness from human pandemic. What had long been a localized hazard in the remote steppe now found pathways into the bloodstream of the wider world. To the people of the time, there was nothing unusual in this chain of events. Trade caravans had always moved across Central Asia. Merchants had always hunted and trapped. Fleas had always gnawed at the hides of their hosts. The danger lay not in any single moment, but in the convergence. Increased trade under the Mongol Empire knitted together markets from the Black Sea to China, allowing microbes to move with unprecedented speed. The climate shifts created rodent population booms and collapses, cycles that shook loose pathogens once confined to burrows and dens. And in the midst of these changes stood human beings, curious and ambitious, carving routes across continents, drawing invisible threads between distant worlds. It is impossible to name a single patient zero, a solitary figure whose infection marked the beginning of the greatest pandemic in human history. The plague did not emerge in a crowded port or a royal court, but in the liminal spaces where humans brushed against the wild. Perhaps it was a hunter skinning a marmot on a windswept ridge, bitten by the flea that had lost its original host. Perhaps it was a caravan handler, his pack animals infested with rodents that carried infected fleas. Perhaps it was a soldier on patrol across the Mongol frontier, drinking from streams where infected wildlife had died. Whoever it was, their body became the first bridge between nature's quiet reservoir and the roaring tide of human mortality. The spread from animal to human was swift and merciless. A single flea bite could carry enough bacteria to overwhelm the body's defenses. Within days, lymph nodes swelled to grotesque size, fevers raged, and the victim's body became a nursery for countless microbes. When that body weakened and died, fleas abandoned the cooling corpse in search of living blood, carrying their microscopic cargo onward. The plague was no longer confined to the steppe. It had found its way into trade caravans, into military camps, into the arteries of empire. Looking back, the ecological trigger seems inevitable, the product of countless small events that converged at just the wrong moment. A change in rainfall in the grasslands, a collapse of one rodent population and the dispersal of another, the relentless expansion of trade networks across Eurasia, the hunger for furs, for grain, for silver, for power, each piece alone might have passed unnoticed. Together, they created a chain reaction that would reverberate through every kingdom and every village across half the world. The plague did not announce itself with fanfare. It seeped quietly into the bloodstream of societies, hidden in the warm fur of animals, in the invisible crawl of fleas, in the unnoticed cough of a traveller. By the time its presence was undeniable, it was already too late. The steppe, once thought of as a distant wilderness beyond the imagination of European peasants or Egyptian merchants, had in fact been the cradle of a catastrophe that would shatter their world. The tiny spark kindled there would leap across deserts, seas, and mountains until the whole of the known world was ablaze. Nature had always harboured its dangers. Humanity had always lived at the mercy of disease. But the plague was different in its scale and its reach, in the way it harnessed human ambition and environmental fragility alike. The marmot burrows of Central Asia did not look like the beginning of apocalypse, yet it was there, in those shadowed tunnels beneath the earth. that the deadliest pandemic in history began its slow, inexorable journey toward the cities and hearts of empires. Across the vastness of Eurasia stretched a network of roads, tracks, and caravan paths that tied the farthest reaches of the continent together. The Silk Road was not a single highway, but a living system, pulsing with movement, from the markets of Xi'an and the oases of Samarkand to the harbours of Constantinople and the ports of the Mediterranean. Goods, ideas, and ambitions flowed with unprecedented speed. Under the Pax Mongolica, the fractured lands of Central Asia had been hammered into submission, bound by the iron will of an empire that stretched from the Pacific to the Danube. The Mongol conquests were brutal, but once secured, the Khans provided order and security on a scale the region had never known. Where once brigands and rival warlords had made travel perilous, now imperial patrols ensured caravans could move with confidence. Trade blossomed, and so too did the invisible dangers that travelled alongside it. Merchants journeyed in long trains of camels, their burdens heavy with silks, spices, porcelains, and gems. Caravansaries rose at intervals like beads on a string, fortified resting places where travellers could find water, shelter, and protection. These way stations became crossroads of humanity, filled with chatter in a dozen tongues, meals shared around fires, and the mingling of people from vastly different worlds. They were also perfect laboratories for contagion. Fleas infested the bedding, rats gnawed at stores of grain. An illness acquired in one dusty town could be carried 1,000 miles before symptoms even appeared. The very success of Mongol order created an environment where pathogens could hitch rides in safety, moving as reliably as the goods they accompanied. The Black Death's early stirrings followed these arteries. A hunter in the steppe might sell a marmot pelt to a merchant, who packed it alongside bolts of silk. Fleas hidden in the fur survived the journey to Samarkand, and from there attached themselves to other rodents in the bustling bazaars. Ships waited at ports on the Caspian or the Black Sea, their hulls and cargoes alive with vermin that carried the bacterium in their blood. Each link in the chain seemed mundane, the daily commerce of a thriving age. Yet every transaction was another step toward catastrophe, another opportunity for the plague to leap into new hosts and new lands. The scale of connectivity astonished contemporaries. Goods from China could appear in Venetian markets in a matter of months. Diplomats travelled between khanates with official passports sealed by the Great Khan himself, granting them safe passage across deserts and mountains. Even missionaries carried their message along these roads, spreading faith while unknowingly sharing exposure to disease. The Silk Road was not merely a route of commerce. It was the circulatory system of the known world, binding diverse regions into one living organism. When sickness entered that system, it could not be contained. Ports amplified the danger. Constantinople, Alexandria, Genoa, and Venice thrummed with ships unloading cargoes from across the seas. Rats scurried down mooring ropes onto wharves piled high with spices, fabrics, and grain. Sailors carried with them not only stories of distant places but swollen lymph nodes and fevers. A single infected vessel could transform a thriving harbour into a charnel house within weeks. Quarantine, the idea that ships might be held offshore until safe, had not yet been invented. Authorities relied on prayers, processions, and city gates' barriers powerless against an enemy too small to be seen. The Mongol Empire had dreamed of a unified world under its dominion, and for a time it achieved that vision. Letters and goods travelled with speed unknown in earlier centuries. But this unity also dismantled the natural firebreaks that once slowed the spread of disease. Where once mountains or hostile borders might have trapped sickness in one region, now a merchant caravan could cross those same mountains unmolested, carrying infection as efficiently as silk or silver. The plague did not need to conquer fortresses. It simply rode along on the backs of those who had already unlocked the gates of empires. Contemporaries could not grasp the mechanism of spread, but they felt the uncanny speed with which disaster leapt from place to place. A caravan might arrive in a city healthy, yet within days its hosts would sicken. Rumours raced even faster than the disease itself. Tales of invisible vapours, poisoned wells, or divine wrath. The speed was terrifying precisely because it was incomprehensible. How could sickness leap from Asia to the Mediterranean in the span of a few years? To those who lived through it, the answer could only be the hand of God or the malice of hidden enemies. But behind the mystery lay the cold fact of global connection, an early form of globalization that carried not only wealth, but death. By the middle of the 14th century, the Silk Road's arteries were filled with the lifeblood of commerce and the hidden poison of plague. The same system that had enriched empires and dazzled merchants now became the perfect superhighway for a microscopic invader. As caravans pushed westward and ships set sail, the stage was set for the greatest pandemic the world had ever known. The superhighway that had promised prosperity would instead deliver devastation, carrying death farther and faster than the world had ever seen. The Genoese port of Caffa sat on the edge of the Black Sea, its sturdy walls bristling with towers and its harbours crowded with ships that connected it to Constantinople, Venice, and beyond. It was a place born of commerce, a gateway where Italian merchants met the riches of the East, trading cloth, silver, and slaves for spices and silks. In 1346, the city became something more, a crucible where war, commerce, and disease converged in a single moment that would send ripples across continents. Outside its walls, the armies of the Golden Horde gathered, Mongol horsemen who had swept across the steppes with terrifying speed. They came to bring Caffa to heel, to break the stubborn enclave of foreign merchants who resisted their authority. But as the siege tightened and the weeks turned into months, a more insidious enemy crept into the besiegers' camp. Soldiers began to sicken with fevers, swellings, and sudden death. The plague had arrived. Contemporary chroniclers described it with dread. Bodies blackened and bloated, men who had ridden into battle with the ferocity of conquerors were reduced to helpless victims, collapsing in their tents and rotting before they could even be buried. The disease tore through the camp with such speed that entire companies were left leaderless. Their commanders struck down in the space of days. The besieging army, once a force of terror, became a sprawling charnel ground, where corpses piled faster than they could be disposed of. Fear grew not only within the Mongol ranks, but also inside the walls of Caffa, where defenders watched the grim spectacle unfold. It was in this moment of desperation that legend says the Mongols turned to an unthinkable weapon. According to the Italian notary Gabriele de Mussi, who later recorded the tale, the besiegers loaded the corpses of their plague-stricken comrades onto catapults and hurled them over the walls. The stench of death, the grotesque rain of bodies landing within the city, was intended to break the morale of the defenders. But more than fear, it may have carried infection. Fleas abandoning cooling corpses, or even simple exposure to the fluids of the dead, could have been enough to spark an outbreak among those inside the walls. Whether this was true biological warfare or simply the inevitable seepage of disease into a city already surrounded and strained, the result was the same. Soon, the plague was raging inside Caffa as well. Panic spread as quickly as the sickness. Merchants and sailors packed their belongings and scrambled to the docks, desperate to escape the twin horrors of siege and pestilence. Ships slipped their moorings under cover of night or sailed boldly in daylight, their decks crowded with refugees. They believed they were fleeing death, but they carried it with them. Rats scurried in the holds, fleas clung to the bedding and clothing, and sailors who coughed into the sea air were already incubating the infection. The ships became floating coffins, and the harbours they reached became new epicentres of catastrophe. From Kaffa, the plague radiated outward like ripples in water. Ships reached Constantinople, where the disease spread rapidly through its dense neighbourhoods, toppling one of the greatest cities of Christendom into crisis. Others reached the ports of the Levant, carrying contagion into Syria and Egypt. Still others made for the Mediterranean, docking at Messina in Sicily, where terrified citizens described sailors staggering ashore with buboes and fevers, collapsing in the streets before the eyes of horrified onlookers. From Sicily, the infection leapt to Genoa, to Venice, and from there across the whole of Europe. What had been a siege in a distant port on the Black Sea had become the ignition point for a pandemic that would reshape half the world. Historians debate the literal truth of the catapulted corpses. Some argue that the disease would have entered Kaffa through rats and fleas regardless, and that the story of biological warfare is more metaphor than fact. But the symbolism endures, for it captures the way war and disease intertwined, how human conflict created the conditions for microbes to spread. The siege of Kaffa was not merely a military encounter. It was a moment when the global networks of trade and conquest intersected with nature's most ruthless killer. From that intersection, the Black Death burst forth into the wider world. Inside the city, despair reigned. Priests struggled to perform burials fast enough to keep up with the dead. Families fled their homes, only to find the streets more dangerous still. Ships, once the symbols of wealth and connection, became the only hope of escape, their sails filling as they carried plague from one coastline to another. In hindsight, the defenders of Kaffa had no chance of remaining untouched. The plague was already inside their walls by the time the first ships left the harbour. What they carried with them was not only their fear, but the seeds of devastation for cities thousands of miles away. The siege broke eventually, not through the triumph of one side or the other, but through exhaustion. The Mongols, decimated by plague, withdrew. The Genoese merchants, equally ravaged, turned their eyes westward, seeking safety in familiar harbours. Yet in this withdrawal lay the true victory of the plague itself. It had transformed a regional conflict into a pandemic, using human ambition, fear, and mobility as its allies. What began with soldiers camped outside a Black Sea port ended with bells tolling in Paris, with Cairo burying thousands in a single day, with the English countryside dotted by abandoned villages. Kaffa became a ghostly symbol of how swiftly the boundaries between war, commerce, and disease could collapse. The catapulted corpses, whether literal or not, stand as a haunting metaphor for the way humans themselves became projectiles in the spread of death. The sailors who staggered aboard ships, the rats that scurried unseen in the dark, the fleas clinging to scraps of clothing, all carried the same payload. From the windswept shores of the Crimea, the plague had found its wings. It would not rest until it had scorched its way across the entire known world. In the autumn of 1347, the harbour at Messina bustled with the usual noise of commerce. Grain ships from the Black Sea creaked at anchor, their holds heavy with wheat for Sicilian markets. Sailors shouted, ropes strained, and gulls wheeled overhead. Yet as the townsfolk gathered to greet the incoming vessels, something was terribly wrong. The crew staggered on deck, gaunt, fevered, their bodies marked by swellings the size of eggs at the groin and armpit. Some lay motionless in the shadows of the rigging, already beyond the reach of prayer. The citizens recoiled in horror. The ships had not brought food and wealth, but death itself. Word spread like wildfire. Within days, sickness had erupted in Messina's narrow streets. Families barricaded themselves in their homes, terrified of contact with neighbours. Priests hurried from house to house with holy oil, yet many collapsed themselves before completing their rites. The authorities tried desperate measures, ordering the ships driven back to sea, but the damage was done. Rats had scurried ashore with the cargo, fleas hidden in their fur carrying the bacterium. Grain unloaded in haste provided food for vermin that multiplied in cellars and storerooms, spreading the plague through the very lifeblood of the city. Panic gripped the population. Chroniclers describe the bells tolling without pause, marking the endless procession of funerals. Sailors who had survived the voyage fled inland, carrying sickness with them to villages unprepared for its arrival. Merchants who had thought only of profit found themselves ruined, their ships abandoned or burned in futile attempts to halt contagion. The island of Sicily, once the vibrant crossroads of Mediterranean trade, became a doorway through which catastrophe entered Europe. From Messina, the pestilence travelled northward with alarming speed. A ship that limped into Genoa brought the same horrors. The city's proud harbour, accustomed to welcoming vessels from every corner of the known world, now became the stage for an unfolding nightmare. Residents watched in disbelief as sailors disembarked only to collapse in the streets. Within days, the infection had spread through the crowded alleys, where families lived cheek by jowl in tall houses clustered along the waterfront. Attempts to impose order failed. Officials sought to ban ships from docking, to isolate those who showed symptoms. But commerce could not simply be halted. Food, grain, and cloth had to move, and with every transaction came the hidden stowaways. Rats nesting in the holds, fleas biting indiscriminately, and humans already sick but unaware. Genoa soon mirrored the fate of Messina. Fires burned day and night as citizens tried to purify the air with smoke. Wealthy families fled to their country estates, leaving the poor to face the full weight of the disease. Streets filled with the sound of wailing, of carts piled with bodies dragged to hurried graves. The once proud maritime republic found its harbours transformed into portals of doom. Each incoming vessel, a possible vector of devastation. From Genoa, the plague continued its inexorable march. Ships that departed before the city closed its gates sailed westward along the coast. One after another, they brought death to Marseille, a city already weary from years of trade rivalries and political strife. When the infected vessels arrived, Marseille's authorities attempted to contain the threat. Sailors were ordered confined, cargoes inspected, and certain ships turned away. Yet these measures were too little, too late. The plague was already embedded in the warehouses, in the grain sacks, in the vermin that gnawed through every barrier. The harbour of Marseille, normally a place of bustling exchange, grew silent. Dockworkers died in droves, leaving ships unmanned and goods rotting on the quayside. Citizens who once thronged the markets now huddled indoors, praying for deliverance. The great cathedral echoed with funeral masses, but priests themselves fell ill, their bodies carried away to join the multitudes. The failure of containment became evident to all. The very design of medieval ports ensured disaster. Ships were moored close together, rats running freely along ropes. Cargo was unloaded into crowded storehouses without inspection or delay. Quarantine as a systematic practice had yet to be conceived. Authorities relied instead on superstition and ritual, burning incense, carrying relics through the streets, and ordering processions to placate an angry heaven. None of it slowed the microscopic invader. By the close of 1347, the pattern was unmistakable. From Messina to Genoa to Marseille, the plague had established itself on European soil. What seemed at first like an isolated outbreak proved instead to be the beginning of a tidal wave. The Mediterranean, once the beating heart of trade and culture, had become a conduit for death. The ships that once promised wealth now delivered pestilence. Each new harbour a step deeper into catastrophe. Contemporaries watched in terror as the disease spread faster than armies, faster than news itself. A ship might leave a port with only a few sick sailors. Yet by the time it arrived at the next harbour, half its crew could be dead. Those who staggered ashore carried the plague into markets, into taverns, into homes. The attempt to shut gates, to drive ships away, to cleanse the air with fire, all of it proved futile against a disease that travelled with rats and fleas, creatures no wall could keep out. The quaysides of Messina, Genoa, and Marseille thus mark the opening act of Europe's greatest tragedy. The plague had crossed the threshold. It would not stop at the sea. It would sweep inland, carried by merchants, pilgrims, and refugees. From port to port, it spread like wildfire, consuming the Mediterranean world in a matter of months. The bells that tolled for the first dead sailors at Messina would soon toll across kingdoms, across mountains, across the breadth of Europe. The Black Death had arrived, and its grim harvest had only begun. The Black Death did not appear in one single, uniform guise. It wore 3 faces, each more terrifying than the last, and all of them born of the same tiny bacterium, Yersinia pestis. To its victims, these forms seemed like different plagues entirely, each with its own signature of horror, yet all carried by the same hidden hand. The disease could creep through a city slowly, taking days to claim a life, or it could explode with shocking swiftness, striking a person down before they had time to make their peace. Physicians and chroniclers struggled to describe what they saw, their manuscripts filled with grotesque imagery, while modern science reveals the grim clinical realities that lay beneath the medieval accounts. The most common face was the bubonic form, the one that gave the plague its name. Victims first felt fever, chills, and overwhelming exhaustion. Then came the swelling of lymph nodes, grotesque buboes that rose like angry tumours at the groin, armpit, or neck. They throbbed with pain, sometimes oozing pus, or turning black with necrosis. Medieval observers were struck by the shocking appearance of these swellings, describing them as apples, eggs, or tumours the size of fists. Once the buboes appeared, the clock was ticking. Some sufferers lingered for days, crying out in agony as their bodies fought a losing battle. A few survived, their immune systems beating back the infection, but most did not. Without modern antibiotics, the mortality rate hovered around 60%. In crowded households and villages, the sight of a swollen bubo was a death sentence more feared than any sword. The second face was more elusive, more terrifying, because it spread in the very air itself. Pneumonic plague began when the bacteria invaded the lungs. A cough, at first ordinary, became a harbinger of doom. Victims spewed bloody sputum, their breath foul with decay, their chests heaving with pain. Unlike bubonic plague, which required the bite of a flea to transmit, pneumonic plague leapt from person to person in droplets carried by a cough or a sigh. This was plague at its swiftest and most merciless. Once the lungs were infected, death often followed within 2 or 3 days, sometimes even faster. Whole households collapsed at once, as family members huddled close to the sick and breathed the same poisoned air. Chroniclers noted with horror how entire streets emptied in days, the disease leaping like fire along the narrow alleys of medieval cities. Survival was rare. Pneumonic plague was almost always fatal in the 14th century, and its speed ensured that it outpaced any attempt at containment. The third and rarest, yet most dreadful face, was septicemic plague. This form struck without warning, bypassing the lymph nodes and lungs to invade the bloodstream directly. Victims could wake in apparent health, and be dead by nightfall. Their skin turned a mottled black as capillaries burst and tissues died, their fingers and toes rotting even before breath left their bodies. Fever raged, delirium clouded the mind, and internal bleeding led to vomiting blood or passing it in the stool. But often, there was not even time for these symptoms to fully develop. The infection overwhelmed the body so swiftly that survival was nearly impossible. Septicemic plague killed virtually every person it touched, sometimes in less than 24 hours. Medieval accounts describe people dropping dead in the streets, struck down as though by a divine thunderbolt, leaving no chance for confession, absolution, or farewell. To those who lived through it, the differences between these forms blurred into one overwhelming truth. Death was everywhere, and it could take any shape. Manuscript illustrations captured the terror in vivid, if exaggerated, detail. Artists painted swollen bodies riddled with boils, streets littered with corpses, demons hovering over the sick. Skeletons danced with the living in grim allegories of mortality. These images, created by those who sought to make sense of the incomprehensible, mirrored the chaotic realities of a world where sickness had no single face and no predictable path. Modern reconstructions provide a clinical clarity to what the medieval mind could only see as divine punishment. We can trace the bacterium's journey from flea gut to human bloodstream, understand how its toxins inflamed lymph nodes, how its invasion of the lungs transformed coughs into weapons, how its flooding of the blood unleashed cascades of clotting and necrosis. Yet this knowledge only deepens the awe at what medieval communities endured. Without medicine, without science, without understanding, they faced all three faces of the killer, with nothing but faith, ritual, and desperate hope. What made the Black Death so catastrophic was not only the scale of its spread, but the multiplicity of its forms. A community might brace itself against one version of the disease, only to be blindsided by another. A village that thought it could avoid fleas by burning straw and killing rats might find the air itself poisoned by pneumonic transmission. A household that thought it had escaped with mild symptoms might suddenly lose a healthy member to the lightning strike of septicemia. The unpredictability shattered confidence, creating the impression that no one was safe, no measure sufficient, no prayer strong enough. The three faces of plague embodied a spectrum of terror: the lingering agony of bubonic swellings, the choking dread of pneumonic infection, the sudden annihilation of septicemic shock. Together, they formed a perfect storm of fear, a triad of death that defied explanation and overwhelmed societies. It is no wonder that the survivors saw in these symptoms the hand of God, the judgment of heaven, or the malice of unseen enemies. For how else could they comprehend a disease that shifted shape, attacked in so many ways, and left so few alive in its wake? The Black Death was not one plague, but three, fused into one catastrophe. And as it swept across Europe and beyond, each form left its own scars on memory and imagination. To the peasants who dug hurried graves, to the physicians who scribbled futile prescriptions, to the priests who watched their congregations vanish, the faces of the plague were unforgettable. It was a killer that could crawl, fly, or strike like lightning, a single pathogen that wore many masks, and behind each mask lay the same unanswerable silence. The firestorm began on the edges, a spark in Sicily in 1347, and within 4 years it had swept like a living inferno across an entire continent. What had arrived by ship at Messina, Genoa, and Marseille now leapt inland along caravan routes, rivers, and the ceaseless traffic of human life. The disease did not move evenly. It surged into cities first, where people crowded together in walled neighbourhoods and then rolled outward into the villages and hamlets, burning through countryside as relentlessly as it consumed ports and markets. By 1351, Europe lay transformed. Its map not of kingdoms and principalities, but of death itself. The spread followed the arteries of commerce and pilgrimage. From Sicily, ships carried the pestilence into Iberia. Barcelona was struck in the spring of 1348, its population reeling under the sudden onslaught. From there, it moved inland to Zaragoza and across to Seville, cutting down nobles and peasants alike. Chroniclers spoke of processions of carts filled with corpses, of churches overflowing with the dead, of the silence of abandoned homes. Portugal fared no better. Its coastal towns ravaged before the sickness climbed the valleys and struck the interior. The Iberian Peninsula, with its blend of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities, became a shared graveyard where distinctions of faith mattered little in the face of the unseen killer. Northward, France felt the hammer blow next. Marseille, struck in 1347, became a gateway for plague caravans pushing up the Rhône Valley. Avignon, then seat of the papacy, suffered terribly. Pope Clement VI barricaded himself in chambers hung with tapestries soaked in vinegar, praying the fumes might cleanse the air. Outside, the streets ran with funerals. Paris soon followed, its immense population a perfect target for the plague's appetite. Tens of thousands died in the capital, while surrounding towns and villages collapsed into ruin. From Normandy, ships carried the disease across the Channel. England's fate was sealed. In the summer of 1348, the pestilence reached the southern coast of England, landing at Melcombe Regis in Dorset. From there it spread with merciless speed. Bristol, London, Norwich, each city became a theatre of horror. London lost perhaps half of its inhabitants. Entire parishes ceased to function, their priests lying among their flocks in mass graves. Monasteries, once bulwarks of learning and charity, were hollowed out as brothers fell one after another, leaving only silence behind cloister walls. The countryside reeled as well. Villages lost so many labourers that fields lay unploughed, harvests rotted, and famine threatened even those who survived the disease. In some regions, mortality climbed so high that whole settlements were abandoned, left to the weeds and the wind. The Low Countries, with their dense trading towns, endured the plague with particular ferocity. Bruges and Ghent, centres of cloth production and international exchange, saw mortality rates to rival the great capitals. Merchants who had once thrived on global networks now died because of them. Fleets that had brought wool and spices now ferried only contagion. The Rhine carried death deeper still, its waters reflecting the funeral pyres of cities that could not keep pace with the burials. Cologne, Strasbourg, Basel all felt the touch of the firestorm. Eastward, the Holy Roman Empire fractured under the weight of mortality. German princes, bishops, and burghers alike could not shield their people from the invisible foe. Mortality varied wildly from place to place, but everywhere fear and suspicion spread. Some towns collapsed into chaos, their governments disbanded by death. Others managed grim efficiency, digging trenches and regulating burials, as though death itself could be organised. The countryside fared unevenly. In some areas, isolation offered temporary protection, while in others, travelling merchants or desperate refugees carried the plague into even the smallest hamlets. By 1350, the firestorm had reached Scandinavia. The disease crossed the sea lanes, carried by ships sailing from England and the Low Countries. Bergen in Norway was one of the first to fall, its population decimated as the plague made landfall in the fjords. From there, it travelled inland, striking at scattered settlements already fragile in their isolation. Sweden and Denmark followed, their royal courts reduced in number, their villages shrouded in grief. Even the distant north, once thought beyond the reach of southern catastrophes, could not escape. The plague respected no geography, no climate, no faith. Mortality cut uneven bands across the continent. Cities, with their density, filth, and constant movement, suffered the most. Florence may have lost 60% of its people. Venice, Paris, and London endured comparable devastation. In the countryside, the toll was patchier, but no less terrible. Some villages disappeared entirely, their fields reverting to forest, their names forgotten. Others survived with a fraction of their inhabitants, families labouring desperately to till land that once required dozens of hands. The contrast between urban collapse and rural emptiness created a continent reshaped not only by death but by absence. The firestorm's reach was such that it erased distinctions of language, culture, and kingdom. From Sicily to Scandinavia, from Portugal to Poland, the story was the same. Bells tolling until ropes frayed, priests overwhelmed, mass graves swallowing entire generations. Yet the pace and pattern of destruction varied enough to sow confusion and despair. Why had one village lost nearly all its people, while another a few miles away endured with minimal loss? Why did some cities collapse within weeks, while others staggered on for months? Medieval minds found no answer, only mystery, and in that mystery they saw the hand of God, the work of demons, or the punishment of heaven for sins too vast to name. Between 1347 and 1351, Europe endured one of the most concentrated bursts of death in human history. Modern estimates place the toll between a third and half of the continent's population, perhaps 75 million people across Eurasia and North Africa, perhaps more. The sheer speed of the devastation made it unlike any famine or war. This was not a crisis that dragged across decades, but a lightning strike of mortality that reconfigured societies in a single generation. The firestorm burned itself out in 4 years, but its ash and scars would remain for centuries. What began as a spark in a Sicilian harbour became an inferno that leapt from kingdom to kingdom, city to city, field to field. It left behind empty streets where once children played, fallow land where once peasants laboured, and silence where once the bells of thriving towns had rung. By 1351, the firestorm had passed, but Europe was no longer the same continent. Its people lived with the memory of the years when death itself stalked every road, every port, every breath. The map of kingdoms remained, but over it all lay another map, invisible yet indelible. The geography of grief. The Black Death did not confine itself to Europe. Its reach was vast, stretching across continents and civilizations, carving a trail of devastation through the Islamic world and deep into Asia. The same arteries of commerce and pilgrimage that had bound the medieval world together became the channels of contagion. From Cairo to Damascus, from Baghdad to the distant steppes of Central Asia, the plague left scars so deep that generations would speak of them as the pivot of history. Cairo, the jewel of the Nile, was among the first great cities of the Islamic world to feel the pestilence's hand. At its height, the metropolis may have held 500,000 souls, its streets alive with merchants, scholars, and pilgrims. Yet as the plague arrived in 1347, 1348, the vitality of the city dissolved into scenes of horror. Chroniclers wrote of bodies piled in the streets, of funeral prayers echoing without pause, of entire households extinguished in days. The markets, once overflowing with grain and spices, fell silent. Trade routes that had carried caravans across the desert now became the paths of infection. In Cairo, mortality may have claimed a third or even half of the population, transforming the city overnight from one of the richest in the Islamic world into a place of mourning. Further north, Damascus became another theatre of grief. This city, celebrated for its gardens, its scholars, and its place along the pilgrimage route to Mecca, was devastated. One account describes as many as 2,000 people dying each day at the peak of the outbreak, so many that gravediggers could not keep pace. Mosques overflowed with corpses awaiting burial prayers. The sound of weeping replaced the hum of scholarship. Ibn Battuta, the great traveller, passed through the region and bore witness to the scale of the calamity, noting the desolation of communities once vibrant with life. Baghdad, once the glittering capital of the Abbasids, had already endured centuries of political decline, Mongol invasion, and shifting fortunes. Yet even in its diminished state, the plague's arrival in the mid-14th century delivered another crushing blow. Contemporary accounts tell of families wiped out, of markets abandoned, and of survivors left to wander among ruins. For a city that had once been the intellectual and cultural beacon of the Islamic world, the Black Death was another chapter in its tragic decline. Perhaps the most haunting testimony comes from Ibn Khaldun, the great North African historian and philosopher. Writing in Tunis after the plague had swept across the Maghreb, he confessed that the catastrophe had extinguished much of his own family. In his Muqaddimah, he observed how the pestilence devastated nations and caused populations to vanish. It swallowed up many of the good things of civilization and wiped them out. For Ibn Khaldun, the plague was not only a biological disaster, but a civilizational one, a rupture that shattered dynasties, emptied schools, and broke the continuity of tradition. His words capture both the personal grief of a man who lost kin and the broader collapse of the world he knew. The plague's march through the Islamic world was not uniform. Some regions endured repeated waves. Others were spared the full fury, but still destabilized by fear and economic disruption. Pilgrimage routes to Mecca became both vectors of disease and stages for extraordinary acts of faith. Pilgrims carried the plague across Arabia, but they also carried prayers, processions, and pleas for divine mercy. The Kaaba, center of the Islamic world, stood as a beacon for supplicants even as death thinned their numbers. Beyond the great cities of the Middle East, the Black Death penetrated Central Asia, Persia, and the Caucasus. Here, it struck societies already scarred by Mongol wars and political fragmentation. Caravan towns along the Silk Road, once sustained by the constant movement of goods and people, withered under the twin pressures of shrinking trade and epidemic disease. In Persia, entire villages disappeared, and dynasties staggered under the loss of soldiers, tax revenue, and administrative talent. Chroniclers describe landscapes littered with abandoned settlements, wells choked with neglect, and fields lying fallow for want of hands to till them. In the Caucasus, nestled between mountains and steppe, the plague's arrival fed into existing cycles of war and upheaval. Christian and Muslim communities alike suffered, their shrines filled with the desperate prayers of populations convinced that divine wrath had fallen. Yet here, too, the disease moved in waves, its unpredictability breeding further terror. A valley might be stripped of life while a neighbouring one endured with few losses, feeding rumours of sorcery, curses, or the fickle hand of fate. From these regions, the plague pushed into the steppe, riding with caravans and horsemen into the lands of Rus. Already weakened by Mongol domination, the principalities of Russia faced a disaster that few were prepared to meet. Novgorod, Pskov, and Moscow all experienced waves of mortality. Chronicles speak of villages so reduced that wolves roamed freely among the empty houses, unchallenged by human presence. The Orthodox Church, like its counterparts elsewhere, struggled to offer meaning amid the devastation, leading prayers and burials, even as its priests perished in great numbers. The reach of the Black Death, even into the heart of Asia, underscores its position as a truly intercontinental catastrophe. The very networks that had once made the medieval world more interconnected than ever before, the Silk Road, the maritime trade routes of the Indian Ocean, the pilgrimage paths to Mecca, now served as the channels of ruin. What had been arteries of prosperity became veins of infection. The Islamic world's encounter with the plague differed in texture from that of Europe, but the scale of suffering was comparable. Cairo's scholars, Damascus's traders, Baghdad's families, all were reduced in number, their confidence shaken, dynasties faltered, economies contracted, intellectual traditions were interrupted. Yet, like Europe, the Islamic world endured. Out of devastation came adaptation, new social structures, new religious movements, new ways of understanding divine will. The plague's journey into Central Asia and Russes showed that no corner of the connected medieval world was truly isolated. The disease's path stretched from the Mediterranean to the steppes, from the Nile to the Caucasus, reminding contemporaries and modern readers alike that pandemics respect no border, no creed, no empire. In Cairo, Ibn Khaldun wept over his lost family and declared the world changed forever. In a village on the steppe, a herdsman buried his kin in silence. Both were bound by the same catastrophe, victims of the same invisible hand that had turned the known world upside down. China, vast and teeming, was no stranger to calamity, but the mid-14th century brought disasters that seemed to arrive all at once. Climatic instability, rebellion, political disarray, and then the silent arrival of the Black Death. The Yuan dynasty, ruled by Mongol elites over a restless majority Han population, already stood on shaky foundations. Tax burdens crushed farmers, floods scoured the fertile plains of the Yellow River, and the countryside simmered with unrest. Into this precarious balance crept a bacterium that had travelled the length of Eurasia, and in China it would leave devastation so profound that historians still debate its true dimensions. The plague struck first in the north, along the frontier, where caravan routes snaked across deserts and mountains. These regions had always been vulnerable to ecological swings. Rodent populations surged and crashed with climate shifts, and their fleas leapt to human hosts when food grew scarce. Traders carried pelts, grain, and spices from oasis to oasis, never knowing that hidden in their wagons clung the seeds of catastrophe. From the Mongol capital of Kumberlik, Beijing, to the garrisons that dotted the steppe, accounts describe sudden, explosive outbreaks. In some areas, entire villages are said to have vanished, their inhabitants buried hastily or left unburied as survivors fled. The disease did not remain confined to the northern frontier. As caravans pushed southward and imperial messengers galloped along their routes, the contagion seeped into the heartlands of China. Reports tell of cities emptied in weeks, of farmland abandoned because no one remained to plant or harvest. Yet, unlike Europe, where chroniclers describe the plague with grim clarity, the Chinese record is more elusive. Official annals often buried calamity beneath formulaic phrases, speaking of great mortality or pestilence without naming causes. Other texts were lost altogether in the fires of rebellion and dynastic collapse. What emerges is a patchwork of fragments. Outbreaks in Hebei, devastation along the Yangtze corridor, mortality so severe in some prefectures that tax registers collapsed. The Yuan dynasty, already fraying, buckled under the combined weight of plague and unrest. Banditry flourished in the empty countryside. Secret societies, like the Red Turbans, found fertile ground for rebellion among populations who saw no relief from either Mongol tax collectors or divine wrath. The plague thinned the armies meant to suppress these uprisings, while famine and flood magnified the crisis. By the 1360s, the Yuan court was reeling. Its authority shriveled to little more than its northern strongholds. When Zhu Yuanzhang, a peasant rebel turned warlord, proclaimed the Ming dynasty in 1368, he did so in a landscape already depopulated and exhausted by plague's scythe. How many died in China is a question that has haunted historians for centuries. Some early Western scholars, extrapolating from fragmentary sources, imagined that tens of millions perished, perhaps even a third of the empire's population. Others argue that mortality, while severe, has been overstated, pointing to the resilience of certain regions and the continuity of Chinese institutions. The truth is obscured by what might be called the undercount problem. In a society where tax registers and household counts were the measure of demographic reality, entire regions dropping out of record-keeping due to rebellion or collapse meant that their losses vanished from official statistics. Silence in the documents does not mean absence of death. Contemporary Chinese writers sometimes tried to capture the horror. Accounts tell of entire households falling sick in a single day, of corpses left unburied because there were none left to bury them. In some towns, officials recorded that 90% of the population had perished. Yet the reliability of such numbers is impossible to prove. Were they sober tallies, exaggerations born of despair, or rhetorical flourishes meant to emphasize the scale of divine punishment? Modern scholars tread carefully, triangulating evidence from archaeology, climate data, and fragmentary records to piece together the contours of the catastrophe. What is clear is that mortality was uneven. Some regions endured horrific losses, while others escaped relatively lightly, but the scale was nonetheless transformative. The plague's impact on the Yuan-Ming transition cannot be overstated. The Mongol rulers, already unpopular, lost both tax revenue and manpower to the epidemic. Their authority drained away with every empty field and every abandoned village. For rebels, the plague was both curse and opportunity. It depopulated strongholds, weakened garrisons, and created masses of displaced people who could be recruited into rebel armies. For the Ming, rising from the ashes, plague became part of the story of renewal. The disease had swept away the corrupt and the foreign, leaving space for a native dynasty to restore order and prosperity. Yet even the Ming rulers could not entirely banish the spectre. Outbreaks continued in later decades, flaring up unpredictably, reminders that the enemy was never truly gone. The demographic debate continues into the present. Some argue that China may have lost as many as half its population during the 14th century, plunging from 120 million to as few as 60 million. Others suggest the drop was exaggerated by bureaucratic collapse rather than actual mortality. Perhaps both factors intertwined, mortality and record failure, reinforcing one another until the state itself lost track of its people. What is undeniable is that the landscape of China was reshaped. Regions once thickly settled became sparsely populated. Labour shortages altered agricultural patterns. Social hierarchies shifted as survivors claimed land and opportunities that once belonged to others. Beyond the numbers lies the human experience. Villages where children's laughter had once rung now echoed only with the creak of shutters in the wind. Temples filled with prayers for relief, incense rising into the air heavy with grief. Travellers along the Grand Canal saw stretches of waterway deserted, docks where no barges came to unload grain. Survivors carried stories of loss into the Ming era. shaping cultural memory for generations. To live through the 14th century in China was to know fragility, to sense that even the greatest of empires could be humbled by an enemy too small to see. The Great Dying in Asia was thus both a demographic event and a civilizational rupture. It accelerated the fall of one dynasty and smoothed the rise of another. It scarred the countryside and hollowed out the cities. It left behind questions that historians still struggle to answer. How many died? Where exactly did the plague strike hardest? And how deeply did it change the course of Chinese history? The silence of the records, the gaps in the archives, are themselves part of the story, a measure of how overwhelming the catastrophe was. In the end, the plague's Asian chapter stands alongside Europe's as part of a single, world-spanning cataclysm. The same disease that emptied villages in Tuscany also haunted the fields of Hebei. The same bacterium that silenced Parisian streets also stalked the caravan towns of the Silk Road. The Black Death was never a European disaster alone. It was a global reckoning, and Asia bore its share of the burden. The gates of the city are closed, but not to keep an army out. Within the walls, a different kind of siege has taken hold, one that cannot be lifted by surrender or broken by a sortie. The streets, once alive with merchants hawking their wares and apprentices hurrying with baskets of bread, have fallen into eerie silence. Inns that once welcomed travellers slam their shutters, their hearths gone cold. Alley houses that used to ring with laughter are now barred tight, for their patrons lie beneath the earth or are too afraid to gather. Daily life, once so ordinary, has turned surreal as the plague winds through every alley, every home, every breath of the city. Corpse wagons groan along cobblestone streets, iron-rimmed wheels cutting through the quiet. Men with rags tied across their faces call out in hoarse voices for the dead. "Bring out your dead," they cry, though often no one answers. Sometimes a door creaks open just enough for a body, wrapped in a sheet, to be pushed into the street before the door is shut again. At other times, the collectors must break into houses where neighbours report no movement for days, only to find entire families already cold and still. The carts fill quickly, and when the bells toll again, the procession moves to the edge of the city, to pits dug hastily by those still able to wield a spade. Mass graves swallow them. No names recorded, no prayers said beyond the hurried mutterings of exhausted priests. The soundscape of the city is unlike anything its inhabitants have ever known. Bells toll constantly, signalling death after death, until their chimes blur into an unceasing dirge. Dogs howl in deserted courtyards. At night, the silence is broken by wailing from homes where the plague has just struck, or by the rumble of wheels as another load of bodies makes its way toward consecrated ground. The lamentations rise like smoke, a soundtrack of grief that hovers over every street and square. In this world, the business of death becomes the city's chief occupation. Testaments and wills are drafted in haste as men and women call upon scribes to record their final wishes before the sickness overtakes them. Wealthy merchants bequeath fortunes to their surviving kin, or, in the absence of heirs, to the church, hoping to secure prayers for their souls. Artisans leave their tools to apprentices who may not live long enough to use them. Mothers dictate hurried instructions for the care of surviving children, even as fever begins to cloud their minds. The act of writing a will becomes as common as buying bread once was, a grim ritual that acknowledges death's inevitability. Priests move through the city like shadows, bearing the sacraments to the dying. Their task is impossible. So many sick, so few left to minister. Last rites are delivered quickly, whispered over one bed before rushing to the next. Some priests fall ill themselves, and are carried away by the very disease they tried to fight with prayers. Others refuse to enter infected homes, terrified of contagion, leaving parishioners to die unshriven. Faith itself trembles under the weight of so much death. For some, the plague is proof of divine wrath, a punishment for sins too great to name. For others, it is evidence that the heavens have turned their face away, abandoning mankind to its fate. Markets collapse as fear spreads faster than commerce. Grain rots in warehouses because no one dares to unload it. Fishmongers vanish from their stalls, and butchers refuse to cut meat from animals suspected of harbouring corruption. The very act of buying food becomes perilous, as people fear that goods, coins, or even the briefest touch might carry death. Barter replaces coin in some quarters, neighbours trading bread for cloth, or a jar of oil for a jug of ale. Yet trust frays, and transactions are haunted by suspicion. The city's rhythms, once marked by festivals, markets, and religious processions, are now measured in funerals. Entire guilds vanish, their workshops shuttered, their insignias left to gather dust. The great feasts of the church year pass in silence, replaced by endless funeral masses, or by nothing at all when the clergy are too overwhelmed to observe them. Pilgrimages are abandoned, processions dissolve, and even the ringing of bells for Vespers takes on the hollow tone of mourning rather than celebration. For those who survive, the city becomes a place of constant improvisation. Children are left to fend for themselves. When parents die suddenly, neighbours who once shared meals now avoid even speaking across thresholds, fearing that words themselves might carry infection. Wells stand untended, their ropes frayed, as those who drew water lie in graves. Garbage piles in corners of courtyards, uncollected, as the sanitation of the city collapses under the weight of illness. And yet, in the heart of despair, acts of resilience appear. Some nurse the sick, even at the cost of their own lives, driven by love, faith, or duty. Brotherhoods of flagellants parade through the streets, whipping themselves in hopes that penance might turn aside divine anger. Healers, herbalists, and charlatans alike sell remedies, vinegar, washes, theriacs, incense that promise little, but provide a sense of action against the unseen enemy. Families gather in prayer, reciting psalms or litanies, clinging to the fragile hope that faith will shield them. At night, the city is cloaked in a silence so heavy that even the stars seem to look down with pity. Torches gutter in deserted lanes, and the wind carries the faint smell of smoke from burning possessions. For some believe that fire can purify what sickness has touched. Dogs, cats, and even livestock wander untended through streets where their masters no longer walk. It is as if the city itself has become a stage on which humanity plays out its most desperate drama, the thin line between life and death, illuminated by the flickering light of lamps. Inside, a medieval city under siege by plague, time seems to stand still. The bustling rhythms of trade, craft, and worship have dissolved into a monotony of fear and grief. Every cough is suspect, every touch a risk. Bells toll, wagons creak, priests hurry, scribes write, and graves open endlessly. The people live as though the world has narrowed to a single question. Who will still be alive tomorrow when the sun rises over the city walls? The speed was what terrified contemporaries most. It seemed impossible that a single disease could leap from town to town, province to province, with such unrelenting pace. Chronicles describe entire regions overwhelmed within weeks, cities falling silent in a matter of days, and ships bringing the sickness from distant ports only to see their crews dead before the voyage was even complete. Historians and scientists ever since have struggled with the same question that haunted the 14th century. Why did the plague spread so fast? The classic model is well known. Fleas feeding on infected rats, then abandoning their dying hosts to bite humans. The bacterium Yersinia pestis blocked the flea's gut, causing it to regurgitate infected blood into each bite. In this picture, the black rat, Rattus rattus, serves as the perfect accomplice, thriving in granaries, markets, and ships' holds, carrying the fleas into close contact with people. This model explains much. The clustering of outbreaks around grain shipments, the vulnerability of port cities, the sudden flares when food stores swelled with new harvests. Yet the flea rat chain alone struggles to account for the sheer velocity of spread across Europe and the Middle East, where mortality waves swept at a speed that seemed to outpace the rodents themselves. Some modern researchers argue that human ectoparasites, fleas and lice living directly on people and in their clothing must have played a greater role. In crowded medieval households, where families shared beds and rarely washed garments, lice and fleas found perfect breeding grounds. If these parasites carried the plague directly from person to person, the speed of contagion becomes easier to understand. Studies of later outbreaks, alongside mathematical models of household clustering, suggest that transmission by human ectoparasites could indeed produce the mortality curves described in contemporary sources. It was not just vermin scurrying in the shadows, but the very fabric of daily life, woolen cloaks, straw bedding, skin-on-skin contact that spread the pestilence. Seasonality provides another clue. The plague surged most ferociously in warmer months, when flea activity peaked and lice multiplied in sweaty clothing. Yet there were also devastating winter outbreaks, especially in northern Europe. When rats were scarce and fleas dormant, something else was carrying the disease across those months of frost. Perhaps human parasites bridged the seasonal gap, or perhaps pneumonic plague, the lung-to-lung form spread by droplets flared more often than the records can clearly distinguish, passing invisibly through coughs and sighs in close, smoke-filled rooms. Winds and weather may have aided the spread. Medieval people themselves remarked on the foul air that seemed to precede outbreaks, the miasmas that rolled in with damp breezes. Though wrong in their theory of poison vapours, they were not entirely mistaken about atmosphere. Fleas and lice thrive in humid conditions, and outbreaks often followed heavy rains or damp summers. Grain stores, swelling after good harvests or trade deliveries, provided nesting grounds for rodents and the parasites that came with them. The rhythms of agricultural and trade cycles may have dictated the very tempo of the disease, with peaks and troughs shaped by the movement of food, pests, and people. Ships, too, became floating incubators. Rats thrived in the dark corners of cargo holds, feeding on spilled grain, nesting in coils of rope, their fleas ready to leap to sailors when hunger forced them upward. Voyages across the Mediterranean could take mere days, and with each arrival, the disease leapt another hundreds of miles. Crews infected in one port often staggered ashore in another, dying on the quayside, leaving behind fleas and contaminated goods. Quarantine measures, 40 days of enforced isolation for arriving ships, were born of this horror, but in the 14th century, they were too little, too late. By the time the watchman barred the gates, the disease was already in the streets. The pattern of spread is visible in the maps drawn by modern historians, concentric waves moving across Europe at a terrifying pace, rarely slowing, sometimes accelerating. Sicily to Florence in less than a year, Paris to London in only a few months, Bergen to Moscow within the same decade. The plague ignored borders, outran armies, leapt mountain ranges and rivers. Only geography and climate offered occasional reprieve. Remote villages, high alpine valleys, or thinly populated regions might escape for a time, though few escaped forever. The debate continues in laboratories and archives. Some argue for the primacy of rats and fleas, pointing to archaeological finds of their remains in medieval contexts. Others emphasize lice and human fleas, bolstered by mathematical models of mortality patterns that align better with person-to-person parasite spread. Still others remind us that pneumonic plague, though rarer, could ignite sudden firestorms of death, especially in crowded urban quarters where cough and breath mingled in stagnant air. The likely truth is that all these mechanisms intertwined, their dominance shifting with season, climate, and circumstance. For the people who lived through it, the mechanisms hardly mattered. What they saw was the speed, the way sickness arrived with terrifying suddenness, like a storm sweeping in from the horizon. One day, a market buzzed with life. The next, half its stalls stood empty. One week, a port city bustled with ships. The next, its harbour was silent, its quays piled with corpses. Families watched helplessly as illness coursed through households in a matter of days, taking parent, child, and servant alike. Priests who buried the dead on Monday were themselves buried by Friday. The pace of death shattered the rhythms of human life, leaving survivors stunned, breathless, unable to comprehend how quickly their world had unravelled. Why so fast? It is a question that will never have a single answer, for plague was not a single enemy, but a convergence of forces. A bacterium, parasites, ships, winds, grain, and above all, human closeness. The medieval world was densely interconnected, bound by trade, faith, and family. It was in that closeness, that intimacy of shared air and shared space, that the plague found its power. And it was in that closeness, too, that fear took hold, as every cough, every flea bite, every touch of cloth might be the moment death arrived. Faith became both anchor and storm when the plague swept across Christendom. In every town and village, men and women searched for meaning in a catastrophe so vast that it seemed only the hand of God could explain it. Churches filled with supplicants, even as priests themselves sickened and died. Bells tolled endlessly for the departed, yet they also called the living to prayer, to confession, to desperate pleas for mercy. The faithful knelt in shadowed naves, listening to sermons that thundered of divine punishment, of sins too numerous to count, or of the need for repentance, before the world itself came to an end. Apocalyptic preaching spread like wildfire. It was said that the pestilence was the beginning of the final judgment foretold in Revelation, that the horsemen of the apocalypse were already riding through the land. Monks and friars travelled from place to place, warning that humanity's wickedness had drawn down God's wrath. Their voices rang from pulpits and marketplaces, declaring that only penitence, fasting, and sacrifice could turn aside the divine anger. People wore sackcloth, shaved their heads, and beat their breasts in public, desperate to show humility before a God who seemed to be scouring the earth clean of his creation. Among the most dramatic expressions of this frenzy were the flagellant movements. Groups of men, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, marched barefoot through villages and cities, chanting hymns, carrying crosses, and lashing their own backs with whips tipped with iron. They bled openly as they moved, their wounds visible proof of their penance. The sound of leather striking flesh, the rhythm of chanting voices, and the sight of bodies bent in pain created a terrifying spectacle that drew crowds wherever they went. To some, they were holy men whose suffering might atone for the sins of the world. To others, they were dangerous fanatics, spreading disorder and fear alongside the disease. Yet for decades, flagellant processions became a common sight, a living testament to the desperation of an age searching for answers in pain. But faith and fear had a darker side, one that demanded a scapegoat. The plague seemed too sudden, too universal to be merely natural. People whispered of poisons in the wells, of powders scattered at crossroads, of conspiracies against Christendom. Suspicion fell on those who already lived on the margins. Jews, whose distinct faith, customs, and resilience in the face of death set them apart. Rumours spread that Jewish communities had plotted the destruction of Christians, that they had poisoned wells with plague-bearing substances, that their survival in some towns was proof of a sinister hand. What followed was some of the darkest tragedies of the 14th century. In town after town, Jewish quarters were attacked. Crowds stormed synagogues, dragged families from their homes, and set entire neighbourhoods ablaze. In Strasbourg, in February 1349, more than 2,000 Jews were massacred in a single day, burned alive or slaughtered in the streets, their possessions seized, their synagogues destroyed. In Mainz, Cologne, and dozens of other cities, similar pogroms unfolded, leaving once thriving communities annihilated. The violence often had as much to do with greed as with fear. Debts owed to Jewish moneylenders could be erased when the creditors lay dead, and confiscated wealth-filled city coffers emptied by the plague. Not all rulers and clerics endorsed the bloodshed. Pope Clement VI issued bulls condemning the accusations, declaring that Jews were dying of the plague like everyone else, and that the disease was clearly an act of God, not of human malice. Some bishops sheltered Jewish populations within their own castles, offering protection against mobs. In a few towns, magistrates enforced decrees forbidding violence, recognizing both the injustice of the accusations and the economic loss their communities would suffer by slaughtering their Jewish neighbours. Yet these defences were often overwhelmed by popular fury, by the sheer weight of panic and despair that turned neighbour against neighbour. For the Jews themselves, the plague years were a nightmare within a nightmare. They died of the pestilence like others, yet also faced torture, exile, and massacre at the hands of their fellow townspeople. Survivors fled to regions more tolerant or more desperate for population, carrying with them both their grief and their determination to preserve their faith. Entire lineages were broken, entire communities wiped from the map, leaving scars that would endure for generations. This fury was not confined to Jews. Lepers, beggars, and foreigners also found themselves accused of spreading the plague. The poor, already vulnerable, bore the brunt of suspicion, beaten or expelled from cities in the hope that their removal might banish the disease. Travellers were turned away at gates, their very presence viewed as a threat. Fear created divisions that fractured society, replacing solidarity with suspicion. Yet amid the violence and fear, faith also inspired resilience. In many places, communities bound together in prayer, organising processions to beg for divine mercy. Saints' relics were carried through streets, thought to possess protective power. Monasteries took in orphans, and confraternities of lay people organised care for the sick and burial of the dead when no one else dared. Even as fury erupted against scapegoats, acts of compassion and solidarity persisted, small lights in a world otherwise darkened by fear. The plague revealed the full spectrum of human response to catastrophe. At one end, mystical devotion, self-mortification, and penitential processions. At the other, suspicion, rage, and the slaughter of innocents. Between them, countless ordinary people struggled to reconcile faith with fear, hope with despair. For many, the Black Death was not just a test of the body, but a crucible for the soul, a time when the boundaries between divine justice and human cruelty blurred, leaving behind both stories of sanctity and stains of blood. In the chronicles of the time, these years read like a fever dream, the wailing of flagellants in the streets, the smoke of burning synagogues rising against a darkened sky, the sermons that declared the world's end, the prayers whispered over the dying, and the endless tolling of bells. Faith, fear, and fury had fused into one, shaping a generation's understanding of what it meant to live and die in an age when death seemed to hold dominion over all. Medicine in the 14th century stood at the crossroads of ancient theory and desperate improvisation. Learned physicians drew upon Galen's doctrines of the four humours, Aristotle's natural philosophy, and centuries of commentary passed down through Arabic and Latin translations. To them, the plague was not the work of an invisible bacterium, but of poisoned air, imbalances within the body, or astral conjunctions that disturbed the harmony of the spheres. The alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345 was widely blamed for corrupting the atmosphere, filling it with lethal vapours. This was the world of miasma theory, where foul airs rising from swamps, refuse, or rotting corpses seeped into lungs and blood, spreading sickness like smoke carried by the wind. Within this framework, treatments and preventatives took predictable forms. Physicians advised people to flee pestilent airs if they could, or to seal themselves indoors with sweet-smelling herbs if they could not. Fires were lit in streets to cleanse the air, and great basins of vinegar were set in public spaces. Citizens carried pomanders, small spheres filled with spices, resins, and dried flowers, pressed to the nose whenever danger seemed near. Some favoured theriac, a legendary compound first concocted in antiquity, blending dozens of ingredients, opium, myrrh, cinnamon, even viper flesh into a universal antidote. Apothecaries sold theriac at high prices, its bitter taste swallowed in hope, if not in confidence. Regimen sanitatis tracts proliferated, prescribing daily habits thought to preserve life. Moderation in diet, avoidance of excess meats and wines, careful exercise, sufficient sleep, all were recommended as defences against corrupted air and bodily imbalance. Bloodletting was practised by some, the idea being to drain away excess humours that made the body receptive to poison. Others swore by herbals. Sage, rue, garlic and wormwood, consumed or burned as protective fumigants. Astrology guided many prescriptions. Physicians calculated horoscopes before administering remedies, believing the stars dictated when the body was most open to healing or vulnerable to harm. Yet for every learned recommendation, countless charms and folk practices circulated among ordinary people. Religious medals were worn on cords, inscribed with prayers for protection. The sign of the cross was traced over food and drink before consumption. Some wore toad amulets, dried and strung around the neck, under the belief that the creature absorbed the poison. Talismans of amber or crystal, pressed against the skin, promised to draw out corruption. Letters purportedly written by Christ or saints, carried in pouches, circulated as spiritual armour against contagion. The image, most indelibly associated with the plague, the doctor in a long cloak, gloves, and a mask with a bird-like beak, did not belong to the initial Black Death, but to later outbreaks in the 17th century. Yet its mythic presence has been projected backward, a symbol of how fear clothed itself in ritual. The beak mask was filled with aromatic herbs, intended to filter miasmas, while the long robe of waxed cloth shielded the body from corrupted air. In the 14th century, protective clothing was less formalized. Physicians and attendants might hold sponges soaked in vinegar to their faces, or wear simple hoods and cloaks, hoping that layers of fabric offered some barrier. The full plague costume would come later, crystallizing the anxieties of centuries into a single haunting silhouette. What medicine did not know outweighed what it did. The very idea of contagion transmission from person to person was hotly debated. Some physicians recognized patterns of clustering and avoidance, noting how attendants and family members often fell sick after caring for victims. Others denied contagion entirely, insisting that bad air alone explained the spread. The lack of microscopes, of germ theory, of modern experimental methods left them grasping at shadows. Still, within those shadows, fragments of practical wisdom glimmered: quarantine, isolation of ships and households, avoidance of crowds, though understood in the language of miasmas, did slow the disease at times. Cleanliness, fumigation, and the removal of filth, though framed as purifying airs, genuinely reduced rat and flea populations in certain contexts. The psychological role of medicine may have mattered most: to consult a physician, to drink a potion, to wear a charm, was to feel some agency in a world otherwise surrendered to chaos. In that sense, theriac and pomanders, herbals and horoscopes, charms and prayers, all fulfilled the same function. They gave hope. The body might still falter, but the soul could believe that it had not stood idle in the face of annihilation. Physicians, despite their limited tools, continued their rounds, prescribing what wisdom and tradition allowed, sometimes dying beside their patients. Barber surgeons lanced buboes, hoping to draw out corruption, even as their knives spread the infection further. Priests carried relics and gave absolution. The line between medicine and miracle blurred. The manuscripts that survive from this era illustrate this world vividly. Margins show grotesque figures holding pomanders, skeletons leading dances, physicians pointing to stars. Herbal books depict sage and rue in delicate watercolour, remedies preserved in script that carried both knowledge and superstition. The scent of vinegar, the smoke of juniper fires, the clang of bells announcing last rites, all these mingled with the chants of flagellants and the cries of the dying, composing the sensory landscape of plague medicine. In hindsight, the futility of most remedies seems cruel. No spice ball could filter a bacterium. No horoscope could halt an epidemic. No dried toad could absorb a poison that lived in blood. Yet to the people of the 14th century, these measures were not illusions. They were survival strategies in a world that demanded action, however imperfect. They reveal a society grappling with incomprehensible death, using the only intellectual and spiritual tools available, weaving together classical theory, folk tradition, and religious faith into a fragile fabric of defense. Thus, medicine during the Black Death was not merely about healing the body. It was about preserving meaning, structure, and hope in the face of devastation. It was about asserting that life still had rules, that the cosmos was not entirely chaos, that there were still ways, however strange or desperate, to resist. And in that, even the charms and pomanders, the theriac and bloodletting, the imagined power of herbs and stars, carried a truth of their own, that the fight against the plague was as much spiritual as it was physical, a battle waged in the heart as much as in the body. The idea of locking sickness away from the healthy seems almost obvious to modern eyes. Yet in the 14th century, it was nothing less than revolutionary. Medieval Europe knew no germ theory, no concept of microscopic contagion, but it did understand patterns. City elders and port officials saw that death arrived with ships, that caravans carried sickness inland, that towns spared early on could still succumb after the arrival of outsiders. From this grim observation emerged one of the most enduring public health innovations in human history: quarantine. The Adriatic port of Ragusa, today's Dubrovnik, played the pioneer. Nestled between mountains and sea, Its merchants thrived on Mediterranean trade, even as plague ships carried ruin from port to port. In 1377, fearful of contagion but unwilling to abandon commerce, the city's council decreed that newcomers from infected regions must not enter the city directly. Instead, they were confined for 30 days on a nearby island or in isolated houses on the mainland, under guard, supplied with food, but forbidden contact. The word Trentino described this period of isolation, a month-long pause between arrival and admission. Soon, 30 days became 40 quaranta in Italian, giving birth to the very word quarantina. The number carried symbolic weight as well. 40 days recalled biblical trials, from the flood in Noah's time to Christ's fasting in the desert. The practical and the spiritual intertwined in a new ritual of protection. From this beginning, quarantine spread across the Mediterranean world. Venice, ever vigilant over its maritime lifelines, built vast lazarettos quarantine stations on islands in its lagoon. These were not makeshift huts, but enduring complexes of stone, with long dormitories, warehouses for goods, and chapels for prayer. Merchants and sailors spent weeks behind their walls, their cargoes fumigated with smoke or sprinkled with vinegar before release. The lazarettos became cities within cities, grim yet essential spaces where commerce and contagion were forced into uneasy balance. Other ports followed, Marseille, Pisa, Genoa, all constructing their own quarantine stations as plague returned again and again in the centuries after the first Black Death. Out of quarantine grew other mechanisms of surveillance and control. Passports of health were devised, documents certifying that a traveller or a ship came from a place free of pestilence. Without such attestations, entry could be denied or confinement imposed. The health passport became a new form of paperwork in a world increasingly regulated by the threat of disease. Cordons sanitaires, the physical blocking of movement across a line, emerged in later outbreaks, with soldiers stationed along roads and river crossings to prevent suspected carriers from entering safe zones. These were crude but effective. Entire provinces sealed themselves off, hoping that sacrifice at the periphery would preserve life at the core. Quarantine expanded the power of the state in ways unforeseen. City councils gained authority to confine, to inspect, to destroy goods deemed infected. Health boards, staffed by physicians and magistrates, arose to supervise these measures. For the first time, municipal governments claimed responsibility not only for order and taxation, but for the health of populations. A new dimension of governance was born, one that reached into private life with unprecedented force. Citizens might find their homes sealed, their movements tracked, their livelihoods interrupted, all in the name of communal survival. Resistance flared, of course. Merchants protested lost profits. Travellers railed against confinement. Smugglers sought secret paths. Yet the logic of quarantine was undeniable. It worked. Though imperfect and often harsh, these measures slowed the spread of disease. Ports that imposed strict quarantines sometimes escaped the worst of an epidemic. Towns that delayed or faltered often paid with staggering mortality. Over time, the practice of enforced isolation became an accepted part of urban life, a grim duty that came with the rhythms of trade and outbreak. Lazarettos became as familiar as markets and harbours, their walls a permanent reminder that prosperity and pestilence were forever entwined. The cultural impact of quarantine reached far beyond health policy. It reshaped notions of space and purity, dividing the world into zones of safety and danger, clean and unclean. It forced populations to accept a trade-off between liberty and survival, a tension that echoes through every subsequent age of epidemic. Quarantine also created a theatre of fear and hope. ships riding at anchor, their crews peering longingly at distant city walls, travellers confined in barren lodgings, counting the days until release, guards standing watch, torn between duty and compassion. For those trapped behind lazaretto walls, the sound of city bells carried both promise and torment the life they longed to rejoin, the world that might or might not welcome them back. Quarantine was never absolute. Smugglers slipped through, bribes secured passage, and some diseases moved faster than officials could react. Yet the very attempt marked a turning point in the history of public health. For the first time, societies accepted collective sacrifice, the restriction of movement, and the suspension of normal commerce as tools to defend the community. These practices, born in the crucible of the Black Death and its aftermath, would endure for centuries, shaping responses not only to plague, but to cholera, yellow fever, and even pandemics of the modern age. In the silence of the lazaretto, with waves lapping against stone walls and the wind carrying the distant sounds of city life, one could feel the birth of a new relationship between individual and society. The plague had taught the terrible lesson that no man's fate was entirely his own, that unseen forces tied lives together across seas and continents. Quarantine was humanity's answer, a wall of time raised against the invisible tide, a fragile hope that by waiting, by pausing the world, death itself could be held at bay. How many died? It is a question that has haunted historians for centuries, whispered across the ruins of abandoned villages and written in the trembling hands of clerks who struggled to keep pace with calamity. The Black Death's shadow stretched across Eurasia and North Africa, leaving in its wake not merely grief, but a demographic chasm so vast that even the most sober estimates stagger the imagination. To reconstruct the toll is to enter a labyrinth of fragmentary records, contradictory testimony, and silences where whole communities cease to exist, leaving no one to record their end. Parish registers, when they survived, offer grim lists of the departed, names inked in hurried succession, pages blotted with the strain of overwhelmed scribes. In some places, the recorders gave up entirely, scrawling a final line. Here it ends. The priest too is dead. Manorial rolls, usually meticulous accounts of tenants, harvests, and dues, suddenly show entire entries struck through. The land falling vacant, the fields untended. Tax registers shrink overnight as taxpayers vanish, leaving royal treasuries stunned by losses impossible to remedy. The mathematics of mortality become clearer in these ledgers than in any lament. In parts of Italy, as much as 60% of urban populations perished between 1,347 and 1,351. Florence's tax records reveal households collapsing one after another until the bustling city stood half empty. In England, manorial documents show villages where more than half the tenants disappeared in a single season. Some parishes lost every inhabitant. Archaeological surveys confirm what the paper trails suggest. Mass graves filled hastily, skeletal remains layered in hurried trenches, the dead commingled without the rituals once considered essential for Christian burial. Regional variation marked the course of the pestilence. In some districts of France and the Low Countries, mortality may have reached 70%, while in remote mountain hamlets or isolated valleys, the plague sometimes passed lightly, sparing more than it slew. Scandinavia endured wave after wave, each time cutting deeper into thinly spread populations, until vast tracts of farmland reverted to forest. In parts of Central Europe, mortality seemed less catastrophic at first, but subsequent recurrences compounded the damage until population levels fell as sharply as anywhere else. Across the Islamic world, from Cairo to Damascus, contemporary chroniclers spoke of death so abundant that funerals blurred into endless processions. Yet in some provinces of Persia and Central Asia, the devastation may have been still greater, erasing entire settlements from the map. Numbers tell one kind of truth, yet they cannot convey the lived experience of loss. A city of 40,000, halved within months, meant not just statistics but empty houses, silent workshops, and children left to wander among corpses. The attempt to count became itself an act of futility. In London, clerks noted burials by the thousand until their own hands stilled. In Avignon, where the papal court struggled to administer sacraments to the endless dying, registers overflowed with names until priests began recording only tallies. 200 today, 300 tomorrow. The arithmetic of despair overwhelmed the language of memory. Modern historians, armed with demographic models, archaeological evidence, and forensic science, attempt to refine the figures. Most agree that Europe as a whole lost between 30 and 60% of its population in the first great onslaught. That range itself reveals both the enormity of the catastrophe and the uncertainty of the sources. For Eurasia as a whole, the Great Belt from China's north through the Middle East and into Europe, the number of dead may have approached 200 million, though any estimate must remain tentative. The scale is almost beyond comprehension. Every third, or even every second, face gone, villages swallowed in silence, great cities reduced to shadows of their former selves. The uneven geography of mortality shaped the aftermath, where entire villages vanished, landlords faced abandoned estates, their manorial roles forever interrupted. Where towns survived with fewer losses, commerce and governance limped forward, reshaping the balance of power between city and countryside. In Italy, the near collapse of Florence and Siena created opportunities for survivors to claim abandoned houses, while in England the disappearance of entire tenant populations undermined the very structure of feudal obligations. Mortality was not evenly distributed across class lines either. Nobles, monks, and peasants all died, though wealth sometimes bought a chance to flee, yet no stratum of society escaped unscathed. Priests died at staggering rates, consumed by their duty to administer last rites. Physicians fell beside their patients. Royal courts, despite isolation, watched heirs and consorts succumb. The silence of vanished places lingers strongest. Archaeologists uncover the outlines of medieval villages in the English countryside. Stone foundations, overgrown by grass, once busy hearths gone cold for centuries. These are not places that faded gradually, but settlements extinguished in a single season, never to be resettled. Forests reclaimed fields, and with them the memories of those who once sowed and harvested. The very landscape of Europe changed, dotted with deserted hamlets that became ghostly memorials to the plague's harvest. In the aftermath, the effort to count the dead took on symbolic weight. Chroniclers wrote in apocalyptic tones, describing a world emptied of half its people. Poets and clerks tried to measure absence in numbers, as if statistics could capture grief. Yet behind every figure lay the unrecorded. Beggars never tallied, infants buried without names, strangers who died far from home. The true number of the dead was always greater than the surviving records could show, a reminder that the scale of the Black Death exceeded the reach of human memory as well as human mercy. Thus the question, how many, is answered only in approximations, shaded by silence and absence. 30 to 60% across Europe, higher in some regions, lower in others. Entire villages gone. Millions of voices stilled, perhaps 200 million across the old world. These figures, vast and imprecise, tell us one essential truth. The Black Death was the deadliest catastrophe in recorded human history, a harvest of mortality that reshaped the destiny of continents. The effort to count is an act not only of scholarship, but of remembrance, a way to give shape to the void left by so many lives extinguished, to read the registers and rolls, to see the numbers scrawled in fading ink, is to glimpse the human struggle to comprehend annihilation, and to understand that the toll of the plague was counted not only in the dead, but in the silence of those left behind. To reckon with emptiness, the Black Death did not simply empty villages and fill graveyards, it shattered the economic and social order that had structured medieval life for centuries. Death had been indiscriminate, but its absence reshaped society unevenly, creating opportunities for some and burdens for others. Out of the silence of abandoned fields and the collapse of entire communities came a transformation no less profound than the plague itself, a revolution in labour, in the dignity of work, and in the terms by which ordinary people related to those who claimed authority over them. Europe before the plague had been crowded, its population pressing hard against the limits of agricultural productivity. Landlords held the upper hand, exacting rents and dues from serfs whose labour supported castles, monasteries, and city markets. Fields stretched to their maximum, and families divided their plots into ever smaller strips. But when the Black Death scythed through, killing a third or even half of the population, the entire calculus of power shifted. Where once there had been too many peasants for too little land, now there was land without hands, fields lying fallow for lack of workers, estates collapsing because no one remained to till the soil. Survivors discovered their labour had suddenly become precious. The same men and women, once bound by custom to provide unpaid service, now found themselves courted with offers of higher wages and better conditions. Landlords desperate to bring their fields back into cultivation had little choice but to compete, and peasants took advantage, moving to new villages, abandoning burdensome obligations, and demanding freedoms that had once been unthinkable. In England, wage levels doubled in some regions, and tenants negotiated cash payments in place of feudal service. Across France, Germany, and Italy, records show a surge of contracts more favourable to the peasantry, evidence of a bargaining power born of catastrophe. But elites did not accept this reversal of fortune quietly. Shocked by the erosion of their authority and the rising demands of those who had once been docile, rulers sought to restore the old order through law. In England, the Statute of Labourers, passed in 1351, attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and punish those who dared to move in search of better offers. It declared that every man and woman of England under 60 who did not live by trade must work at the same rates as before the pestilence, forbidding servants from leaving their masters and criminalising refusal to work. But laws written in ink could not override the realities of supply and demand written in death. The statute was flouted everywhere, with workers walking away from contracts, lords competing against each other despite the prohibitions, and local officials often complicit in ignoring regulations. The tension between new realities and old laws brewed resentment on both sides. For peasants, the efforts to curtail their newfound leverage felt like betrayal after so much suffering. For nobles and monarchs, the sight of commoners dressing better, eating more, and speaking more boldly seemed a dangerous overturning of the natural order. This simmering conflict erupted in violence in the decades after the plague, as peasant revolts swept across Europe. In 1358, the Jacquerie in northern France exploded in fury against nobles who seemed incapable of defending villages from raids, yet still demanded labour and taxes. Bands of peasants rose in arms, attacking manor houses, killing knights, and burning records of dues and obligations. Their rebellion was short-lived, crushed with savage reprisals, but its shock reverberated through French society. In England, discontent brewed for a generation before boiling over in 1381. Taxes imposed to fund wars with France, combined with continued enforcement of the Statute of Labourers, pushed villagers and artisans to their breaking point. What began as local unrest swelled into a mass uprising, tens of thousands marching on London under the leadership of Wat Tyler and inspired by the radical preaching of John Ball. When Adam Delved and Eve Spann, who was then the gentleman? He asked. Challenging the very foundations of hierarchy, the rebels demanded an end to serfdom, fair rents, and freedom of movement. For a moment, it seemed the social contract itself might be rewritten. Though the revolt was suppressed, its memory haunted elites, reminding them that the common people now knew their strength. The aftershocks of this labour revolution stretched far beyond individual revolts. Across Europe, serfdom began to loosen. In some places, crumbling entirely. In Western Europe, especially England and northern France, the institution gradually eroded, replaced by cash rents and freer tenures. The landscape of villages changed as abandoned lands were consolidated into larger farms, sometimes run by prosperous peasants who had seized the chance to rise. In the towns, guilds of artisans grew in power, fueled by the demand for labour and the decline of feudal constraints. Even the church felt the pressure, as monasteries that had once commanded vast estates now struggled to find lay brothers and tenants, their grip on local economies weakening. Not all regions followed the same path. In Eastern Europe, where populations were sparser and lords had greater control, the opposite occurred. Serfdom hardened, as elites bound peasants more tightly to the land in response to labour scarcity. This divergence between East and West would shape the continent for centuries, creating contrasting systems of labour and freedom that persisted well into the modern age. But everywhere, the plague had destabilised the old equilibrium, forcing renegotiations of power and planting seeds of change. The revolution in labour was not merely economic, it was cultural. Survivors lived with a sharper awareness of mortality and a heightened sense of their own worth. Men and women who had seen death mow down neighbours and masters alike questioned why privilege should endure when none were spared. The growing assertiveness of the peasantry, the demands for better conditions, and the willingness to resist oppression all carried the memory of those years when the world turned upside down and the lowly found themselves indispensable. In the long view, the Black Death cracked open the rigid framework of medieval society. Serfdom's decline, rising wages, and the boldness of revolts signalled that the relationship between lord and peasant, between ruler and subject, could be reshaped. The plague had killed indiscriminately, but in its aftermath, it gave survivors leverage to renegotiate the social contract. Out of devastation came transformation, a labour revolution born of suffering, paid for in blood, and carried forward in defiance. It was a reminder that history's darkest catastrophes can, paradoxically, sow the seeds of liberation. The plague emptied cities with a swiftness that stunned contemporaries, silencing the noise of markets and leaving half-built houses to crumble where masons had fallen at their work. Yet the urban story did not end in ruin. Out of devastation came reshaping. As commerce, crafts, and civic life gradually reassembled themselves in new forms, the shock of mortality forced adaptations that altered how cities functioned, how goods moved, and how ordinary people imagined their place within the shifting order. At first, the losses were overwhelming. Merchants vanished, apprenticeships dissolved, and whole guilds dwindled when masters and journeymen alike succumbed. Streets that once thrummed with carts and buyers stood quiet. The bustle replaced by the groan of corpse wagons. Ports found their warehouses empty, caravansaries lay idle, and fairs once famous across Christendom sputtered into silence. Yet even in collapse, the conditions for transformation were brewing. The same mortality that had hollowed urban centres also cleared space for survivors to step into roles that would once have taken decades to earn. A young apprentice who outlived his master might inherit a workshop. A journeyman suddenly found himself in demand, commanding wages and privileges that had once been tightly guarded. Mobility geographic, social, and economic expanded as never before. Guilds, long the gatekeepers of trades and professions, adapted uneasily to this new landscape. Some attempted to enforce strict rules, preserving old hierarchies and restricting entry. But the tide of necessity overwhelmed resistance. Cities needed bakers, butchers, masons and weavers, and guild statutes bent under pressure. Records show an influx of new members, sometimes from rural backgrounds or distant towns, drawn into urban life by opportunity. The careful ladders of apprenticeship shortened. Years of training were waived, requirements eased, and the young found themselves vaulted into responsibilities once reserved for seasoned hands. Craft identity still mattered, but the barriers grew more permeable, reshaping urban economies from the inside out. Commerce, too, adjusted to the thinning of populations. Trade routes contracted at first, as depopulated towns no longer supported the volume of goods they once consumed. But as Europe stabilized, merchants found new niches. Survivors possessed not only more land but more disposable wealth. Freed from the competition of the dead, families that had once lived at subsistence levels now had access to abandoned fields, fuller harvests, and higher wages. They spent their surpluses in towns, stimulating demand for better clothing, improved housing, and imported luxuries. The merchant class, though battered by initial losses, found fertile ground for revival, its fortunes tied to the rising expectations of a society with fewer people but more resources per capita. The abundance of land in the countryside fed directly into this transformation. Where peasants had once eked out survival from overworked plots, they now divided the holdings of the dead among fewer heirs. Diets improved noticeably, with meat, dairy, and grain all consumed more widely. Archaeological remains from post-plague cemeteries reveal stronger bones, taller statures, and evidence of better nutrition. The shift from scarcity to relative abundance filtered into urban markets, filling stalls with a greater variety of foods and giving rise to changing tastes. Bread grew whiter as demand for finely milled flour rose. Meat appeared more often on city tables, preserved by salt imported through expanding trade. Wine and ale flowed in larger quantities, sustaining both celebration and daily routine. Consumption patterns reflected not just survival, but aspiration. Clothing styles became more elaborate, fueled by both new prosperity and a desire to distinguish oneself in a world where old hierarchies had cracked. Wool remained the staple, but silk, linen, and furs appeared with greater frequency among classes that had never before afforded them. Sumptuary laws multiplied as rulers sought to restrain the ostentation of commoners dressing above their station. But these laws were often ignored, their very existence proof of shifting boundaries. Domestic interiors changed as well, with more households acquiring furniture, utensils, and decorative objects once limited to elites. The material culture of Europe took on new richness, shaped by survivors eager to enjoy life more fully in the shadow of death. Urban landscapes reflected these currents of decline and rebirth. In some places, half the housing stock lay abandoned, but the survivors moved in, enlarging their quarters, expanding gardens, or converting former neighbours' lots into workshops and courtyards. Cities that had shrunk eventually began to consolidate, their populations smaller, but their per capita wealth greater. Municipal governments invested in rebuilding projects, cathedrals, and town halls rising anew with funds drawn from both guilds and benefactors, eager to secure their names in stone. Charitable institutions, too, multiplied, as wealthy merchants endowed hospitals, almshouses, and chapels in memory of the dead, reshaping civic identity around acts of remembrance and care. The rhythm of urban life quickened again as commerce recovered. Markets reopened with new vigour, fairs resumed, and trade networks reknit themselves across Europe and the Mediterranean. Italian city-states, with their mercantile connections to the east, surged ahead. Venice and Genoa turning catastrophe into opportunity by monopolising shipping routes. Northern towns of the Hanseatic League consolidated power in the Baltic and North Seas, channeling grain, timber, and fish to hungry but recovering populations. Everywhere, commerce bore the imprint of loss but also of resilience, as the very networks that had carried plague also carried renewal. The social order of cities changed in tandem. The labouring classes gained leverage, but so did artisans and merchants, whose importance to civic life only grew. Nobles, once able to dominate through sheer wealth of land and lineage, found themselves forced to negotiate with councils and guilds that wielded new influence. The plague had democratized opportunity within limits, and urban politics reflected this shifting balance. Revolts and uprisings periodically erupted, driven by frustrations over taxation and attempts to reinstate old hierarchies. But the trajectory was clear. The medieval city was becoming a more dynamic, contested, and open space, shaped by the memory of death and the promise of survival. What emerged in the century after the Black Death was not merely a revival of old forms, but a reorientation of urban and commercial life. Cities grew back smaller, perhaps, but leaner and more adaptive. Guilds became more porous, apprenticeships shorter, and social mobility more attainable. Diets grew richer, clothing more elaborate, houses more furnished. Consumption and commerce expanded, reshaping expectations of what it meant to live well. The plague had destroyed, but it had also cleared ground for a new order, one in which survivors found not just mourning, but opportunity. Out of emptied streets and shuttered shops arose societies more flexible, more prosperous, and more complex than those that had fallen beneath the shadow of the pestilence. In the years after the plague, Europe carried its grief, not only in memory, but in art, in words, and in stone. The pestilence had ripped through every certainty, and survivors sought ways to make sense of a world so suddenly emptied. Out of that need came new forms of storytelling, new images of death, and new devotions that cast long shadows over culture. It was not enough to bury the dead. The living had to interpret what had happened, and in doing so, they reshaped their imaginations of life and mortality. Giovanni Boccaccio set the tone in Florence. His Decameron opens with pages of unflinching detail, describing corpses stacked in trenches and family bonds dissolved by terror. Yet his book was not only a chronicle of despair. It imagined 10 young Florentines fleeing into the countryside to tell each other tales, weaving a tapestry of love, folly, trickery, and resilience. The stories are bawdy and humane, reminders that life still throbbed even as the bells of death tolled endlessly in the city below. Boccaccio gave Europe both a witness's account of the horror and an affirmation that laughter, wit, and storytelling could offer sanctuary in a time of devastation. His work became a cultural touchstone, a way of saying that art could hold grief without being consumed by it. Visual culture, too, absorbed the shock. Church walls and manuscripts began to teem with images of the danse macabre, the dance of death. Skeletons and corpses led kings, queens, bishops, peasants, and children in a grim procession across murals and frescoes. The message was unmistakable. Death spared no station, no office, no wealth. The universality of mortality, seared into collective memory by the plague, took painted form in these grotesque yet oddly rhythmic processions. In them, Europe rehearsed again and again the lesson that the pestilence had taught with such cruelty. All are equal when summoned by the grave. The monuments of the dead themselves changed. Transy tombs replaced serene effigies of knights and ladies in repose. Instead of idealized figures resting in eternal calm, tombs now displayed rotting cadavers, skeletal remains, or flesh devoured by worms. Patrons commissioned these horrifying images of their own posthumous decay. A brutal honesty that marked a new aesthetic. Death was no longer an abstraction. It was a reality to be stared at, carved in stone, and kept before the eyes of the living. Even in repose, memory had to carry the plague's lesson, that earthly beauty and power would dissolve into corruption. At the same time, devotion to new plague saints arose. Communities turned to Sebastian, a Roman martyr pierced with arrows, whose wounds seemed to echo the buboes of plague victims. He became one of the most beloved intercessors, his image repeated in countless altarpieces as protector against pestilence. Roch, another plague saint, emerged from French tradition, remembered for tending the sick and bearing on his own body the sores of infection. Their cult spread across Christendom, shaping both popular piety and the art that adorned chapels and city squares. To pray to Sebastian or Roch was to acknowledge the ongoing threat of pestilence, but also to hope that divine mercy might guard against its return. Literature and chronicles recorded the upheaval in tones ranging from despair to moral reflection. Chroniclers in England, France, and the German lands described the silence of villages, the collapse of institutions, the sheer number of graves dug into the frozen ground. Some interpreted the plague as divine punishment, urging repentance and stricter devotion. Others wrote with a bleak matter-of-factness, cataloguing the horror without attempting explanation. Everywhere, memory became text, and text preserved the trauma for generations. These accounts fed into sermons, into popular tales, into the whispered lore of families that had survived. The darker aesthetic that grew from this experience pervaded even celebrations and entertainments. In music, dirges and lamentations found new prominence. In theatre, morality plays dwelt on themes of sudden death and the fleetingness of worldly pleasures. Even festivals carried undertones of warning. Masquerades featuring figures of death among the revellers. The Black Death had inscribed mortality into the fabric of culture, so that even joy bore an edge of fear, and beauty was shadowed by the certainty of decay. Yet within this darkness, creativity flourished. Painters experimented with more visceral imagery, authors with grittier realism, sculptors with bolder representations of corruption. The plague shattered illusions of permanence and forced art to grapple directly with fragility. The result was not only morbid, but also intensely human. In confronting death so openly, survivors affirmed life with equal intensity. The Decameron's laughter, the macabre murals, the cadaver tombs, the intercessory saints, all were ways of saying, we know we will die, but we will not cease to create, to remember, to hope. Memory itself became a cultural practice. Towns commissioned plague columns and memorial crosses, setting stone reminders in marketplaces where pestilence had raged. Processions commemorated deliverance in years when outbreaks receded. Families endowed chapels and masses for the souls of the dead, weaving remembrance into the rhythms of daily worship. To live after the Black Death was to live in a culture haunted, but also bound together by memory. In this crucible of grief and imagination, a new sensibility was born, somber, honest, fascinated by decay, but deeply invested in the dignity of survival. Art, literature, and devotion became the vessels in which Europe carried its dead and its fears, shaping an aesthetic that would endure for centuries. The plague had emptied streets and silenced bells, but it had also filled pages, canvases, and stone with a testament to the human need to wrest meaning out of mortality. It was a culture steeped in darkness, but also in resilience. The memory of catastrophe transformed into creation. The plague struck at the heart of Christendom, not only in its people, but in its institutions. The Church, long the guardian of souls and arbiter of meaning, found itself both exalted and tested beyond measure. On one hand, priests, monks, and nuns embodied the highest ideals of their vocation, tending to the sick, burying the dead, and offering last rites when others fled. On the other, the magnitude of the catastrophe revealed cracks in the institution, fueling criticism that would echo for centuries. Faith survived, but the unquestioned authority of the Church emerged bruised, reshaped, and burdened with doubts that could not easily be dispelled. In countless towns and villages, clergy were among the most visible martyrs of the plague. Priests entered plague-ridden houses to anoint the dying, inhaling the same air heavy with contagion. Monks opened the doors of their cloisters to tend to the sick, only to see entire communities of brothers and sisters perish in waves. Parish records and chronicles speak of whole convents wiped out, monasteries reduced to a handful of survivors, and churches where no priest remained to say Mass. Their sacrifices inspired admiration and gratitude. For many, it was the devotion of the clergy that preserved hope when all else failed. Yet this heroism coexisted with failure. In some places, priests fled alongside nobles and merchants, abandoning their flocks to die without confession or comfort. Vacant benefices multiplied as clergy succumbed, and replacements had to be rushed into service. Young, barely trained men were ordained in haste to fill the void, eroding standards of education and pastoral care. The quality of ministry declined, and with it came murmurs of discontent. For ordinary Christians who had looked to the Church as an unshakable refuge, the reality was uneven. Some clergy proved heroic, others craven, and the institution as a whole seemed fragile in the face of divine wrath. Indulgences, relics, and special masses became tools for channeling both grief and revenue. The desperate turned to any promise of spiritual protection, purchasing pardons, or commissioning prayers for the souls of loved ones. Pilgrimage sites swelled with supplicants seeking intercession, but critics noted the growing commerce of salvation in the wake of so much death. The line between genuine devotion and financial exploitation blurred. Rumours circulated of indulgence sellers profiting from panic, of priests charging extortionate fees for funerals, of churchmen enriching themselves while their parishioners starved. Though such stories were not universal, their circulation revealed a growing unease with the institution's moral integrity. Out of the trauma grew new currents of lay devotion, confraternities, groups of laymen and women dedicated to prayer, charity, and mutual support proliferated across Europe. These associations offered spiritual solace outside the direct structures of the clergy, emphasizing penitence, works of mercy, and communal solidarity. They organized processions, cared for the sick, and funded chapels, becoming parallel expressions of faith that both supplemented and sometimes rivaled official ecclesiastical authority. For the laity, confraternities provided a sense of agency in spiritual matters, a way to shape religious life directly in response to the plague's devastation. The rise of flagellant movements revealed another dimension of religious response. These bands of penitents marched through towns and villages, beating themselves in public displays of contrition. Their message was simple. The plague was punishment for sin, and only collective repentance could appease divine anger. Though the Church officially condemned many of these movements as heretical or disruptive, their popularity revealed a hunger for direct, visceral religious expression that bypassed traditional hierarchies. For some, the authority of bishops and priests seemed compromised. The body itself, scourged and bleeding, became a living liturgy of atonement. Intellectually, the plague stirred doubts about the institution's ability to explain suffering. Sermons thundered that the pestilence was God's judgment, yet the sheer scale of the dying strained this interpretation. Were infants guilty of sin? Were monks and nuns, who lived in chastity and obedience, deserving of such punishment? Some preachers framed the plague as a mysterious test, others as an inscrutable mystery beyond human comprehension. The theological answers offered did not always satisfy, and seeds of skepticism took root in minds already shaken by grief. The idea that institutional religion might not have a complete grasp on divine will began to linger, faint but persistent. At the same time, new devotions flourished, cults of saints associated with plague intercession. Sebastian, Roch, and Catherine, among them, gained wide popularity. Devotional texts emphasized individual prayer, personal repentance, and the direct relationship of the believer with God. Mystical traditions deepened, with figures like Catherine of Siena calling for reform, purity, and a return to authentic devotion. The hunger for renewal found fertile ground in an age that had seen both the noblest and the most disappointing sides of the Church exposed by plague. The material church was reshaped as well. Cathedrals and parish churches, once crowded with worshippers, stood half-empty in devastated towns. Revenues from tithes collapsed as populations dwindled, forcing dioceses to consolidate or abandon parishes. The vast clerical hierarchy, already stretched, became thinner still. This scarcity, paradoxically, gave rise to innovation, new forms of pastoral care, new emphases on lay responsibility, and new experiments in worship. But the memory of institutional weakness remained, recorded in chronicles that describe priests fleeing, masses unsaid, and sacraments left unadministered. In the long view, the Black Death left the Church with a double legacy. It had demonstrated the courage and sacrifice of countless clergy, cementing their role as shepherds of souls even in the valley of death. But it had also exposed institutional fragility, moral corruption, and the dangers of financializing salvation. Lay confraternities, mystical movements, and reformist voices all gained strength in the wake of the plague, preparing the ground for the religious upheavals of later centuries. The Church remained the central institution of European life, but it was no longer beyond question. Faith endured, but confidence shifted, becoming more personal, more skeptical of clerical authority, and more open to alternative forms of devotion. In plague's shadow, Christendom discovered that even its most sacred institution could falter, and that revelation would shape the course of religious history. The Black Death was never just a single catastrophe, sealed neatly between 1347 and 1351. It was the opening act of a centuries-long drama, a pandemic era that ebbed and surged across continents until well into the 18th century. The first great wave killed tens of millions, and altered the foundations of societies. But it did not vanish with the lifting of that initial storm. Instead, it lingered, returning impulses that reminded every generation that the pestilence was not a story from the past, but a constant, unpredictable threat. The Middle Ages, the Renaissance, even the dawning of the Enlightenment all lived under the shadow of plague. Europe's chronicles are filled with these recurring visitations. In 1361, scarcely a decade after the initial devastation, the pestis secunda swept through, this time striking especially hard at the young who had been spared before. Entire cohorts of children perished, earning the grim nickname, the Children's Plague. Then again, in the 1370s, the 1390s, the 15th century, and onward, plague recurred like the tolling of a bell that refused to fall silent. No one could ever say with certainty that it was gone. Farmers sowed their crops, merchants filled their ships, kings waged their wars, but always with an unease that one outbreak could undo all human plans. London's history shows the persistence of plague as both a civic and a cultural wound. The city was struck repeatedly through the 15th and 16th centuries, but the 1665 outbreak burned its memory deepest. That summer, death bills swelled week by week, recording thousands of burials in cramped churchyards. Houses were marked with painted red crosses, and the plea, "Lord, have mercy upon us." Watchmen locked families inside their homes to enforce crude isolation, while carts trundled at night to collect corpses for mass graves. Samuel Pepys wrote of the terror in his diary, describing empty streets, shuttered taverns, and the silence of a city holding its breath. Even as the Great Fire of London followed in 1666, reshaping the city's architecture, the scars of plague remained carved into its memory more deeply than flame. Elsewhere, the disease remained equally unrelenting. Venice and the other great ports of the Mediterranean wrestled with outbreaks across the 16th and 17th centuries, each arrival threatening to undo the fragile prosperity of trade. Ragusa's quarantines and lazarettos became models, but even the most disciplined maritime republic could not fully prevent the bacterium's return. Marseille, in 1720, stands as one of the last great eruptions of the second pandemic. A single merchant vessel, the Grand Saint-Antoine, laden with silks and cottons from the Levant, slipped past strictures and carried fleas into the bustling Provençal port. Within weeks, 30,000 people lay dead, corpses piled in, hastily dug trenches, and the city's economic lifeblood choked to a halt. This was the 18th century, a world of printing presses, scientific societies, and enlightenment salons. Yet Marseille found itself reliving the same nightmare of bells, burials, and fear that had haunted Europe 400 years before. The persistence of plague owed much to geography and ecology. Rats and their fleas thrived in the granaries, warehouses, and ship holds that sustained global commerce. Ports that never ceased trading, never ceased risking infection. Once established, plague burrowed into local reservoirs, rodents in fields and cities alike that could harbour the bacterium silently until conditions ripened for another outbreak. Climate played its part too. As cool, wet summers or sudden shifts disrupted rodent populations and sent fleas in search of new hosts. What seemed to human eyes like an inexplicable visitation was, in reality, a complex ecological rhythm binding together weather, animals, trade, and human settlement. But the plague was not uniform in its strikes. Some cities, like Milan, seemed able to avoid the worst through strict public health measures, shutting gates, burning infected houses, and isolating entire districts. Others, like Naples or Constantinople, became bywords for repeated devastation. In some places, mortality reached a quarter of the population in a single outbreak. In others, the toll was heavy but survivable. These variations fueled endless debates. Was survival a matter of providence, geography, or governance? No consensus emerged, but the awareness grew that human agency through quarantine, regulation, and vigilance could at least tilt the balance. The cultural impact of these recurring waves was profound. Every generation had its plague stories, its own funerary crosses and lists of the dead. Parents passed on not only land or trade, but the memory of when the sickness last came. Art and literature continued to return to the motif of death as constant companion, even as Europe basked in Renaissance creativity and Enlightenment confidence. The possibility of plague undercut the narrative of uninterrupted progress. It reminded thinkers and rulers alike that human ingenuity was always vulnerable to forces beyond their control. By the late 17th and 18th centuries, plague's grip began to loosen in Western Europe. The reasons remain debated. Perhaps improvements in housing, hygiene, and urban sanitation made it harder for rats and fleas to thrive. Perhaps shifts in global trade routes altered the ecology of disease reservoirs. Perhaps even evolutionary changes in the bacterium itself played a role. But while plague waned in the West, it continued to burn in the Ottoman Empire, in North Africa, and across parts of Asia. Constantinople endured waves deep into the 19th century, and India suffered outbreaks into the 20th. The pandemic era of plague was not confined to one continent, but was a shared human inheritance stretching from China to Morocco. To view the Black Death only as a 4-year apocalypse is to miss its deeper reality. For centuries after, Europe and its neighbours lived in plague time. Outbreaks could cancel marriages, bankrupt merchants, depopulate villages, and topple dynasties. They shaped the development of public health, the authority of the state, and the rhythms of trade. Even as knowledge expanded and societies transformed, the spectre of sudden mortality remained a fact of life. The world did not simply endure one Black Death, it lived in its long shadow for 400 years. In the summer of 1894, as plague erupted in the British colony of Hong Kong, 2 men of science arrived almost simultaneously, each determined to solve a mystery that had haunted humanity for half a millennium. The city was choking under epidemic panic, its streets littered with the dead, its hospitals overflowing with gasping patients, its population fleeing by boat or hiding in cramped tenements. Into this fevered atmosphere stepped Alexandre Yersin, a Swiss-French physician working with the Pasteur Institute, and Shibasaburo Kitasato, a Japanese bacteriologist trained in the German school of Robert Koch. Each brought microscopes, cultures, and confidence, and each hoped to isolate the agent responsible for one of history's deadliest killers. Kitasato was first to announce success, reporting rod-shaped bacteria in the swollen lymph nodes of the dead. But his cultures quickly became contaminated, his results inconsistent. Yersin, working with fewer resources in a makeshift hut, soon found a different organism in the buboes of plague victims, a tiny, bipolar staining bacillus that survived in the blood and tissues. He described it in meticulous detail, sending samples back to Paris. Over time, it became clear that Yersin's identification was correct. The pathogen would bear his name, Yersinia pestis. For the first time, the Black Death had a face, a microscopic assassin glimpsed through the lens of modern bacteriology. The discovery did not end the story. The question of transmission still loomed. If plague was caused by a bacterium, how did it leap so efficiently from victim to victim, across cities and continents? The answer emerged gradually, through experiments that traced the role of fleas and rats. It was found that the flea, feeding on an infected rodent, would ingest the bacteria, which then formed a blockage in its gut. Starving and desperate, the flea would bite again and again, regurgitating bacteria into each wound. This grisly cycle explained both the clustered outbreaks and their explosive spread. Ships, granaries, and markets, filled with rats and their parasites, had been the true incubators of the medieval apocalypse. What had seemed divine punishment or foul miasma was revealed instead as a chain of ecological relationships between microbe, flea, rodent, and human. The timing of Yersin's discovery was uncanny, for it coincided with the onset of the Third Plague pandemic. From the remote highlands of Yunnan in southwest China, plague spilled into villages in the 1850s, then into trading posts, and eventually into port cities. By the 1890s, it had reached Canton and Hong Kong, and from there, the world. Steamships carried infected rats across oceans, and plague appeared in India, Australia, Hawaii, San Francisco, and beyond. The old enemy had returned, this time in an age of telegraphs, railways, and scientific laboratories. Unlike the medieval pandemic, this one could be tracked in real time, its pathways mapped, and its victims recorded. By conservative estimates, the third pandemic killed more than 12 million people, most of them in India and China, even as it seeded small but terrifying outbreaks on every continent. Science rose to meet the challenge. In the first years of the 20th century, researchers developed serological tests that could identify plague infection by detecting the body's immune response. Vaccines were attempted, with mixed results. Waldemar Haffkine, working in Bombay, produced one of the earliest anti-plague vaccines and administered it to thousands, though its protection was limited and its risks considerable. Still, the effort represented a turning point, the first attempt to proactively defend human populations against plague through laboratory innovation. Public health measures, informed by bacteriology, also began to shift. Quarantines and lazarettos were supplemented by rat control campaigns, flea eradication programs, and improvements in sanitation. For the first time, the focus turned not only to isolating the sick, but to targeting the ecological web that sustained the microbe. The struggle was not only medical but social and political. Colonial authorities often enforced plague measures with brutality, entering homes, seizing patients, burning belongings. In Bombay in 1896, entire neighbourhoods were torn down in the name of sanitation. The poor, crowded in tenements, bore the brunt of both the disease and the heavy-handed responses. Resistance flared, as people fled cities or hid their sick relatives from officials. Plague became not only a biological crisis, but a flashpoint of colonial tension, where science and empire collided, yet the arc of knowledge bent toward mastery. By the 1920s and 1930s, the outlines of plague's biology were understood with clarity that earlier centuries could never have imagined. The pathogen was identified, its vectors nailed down, its reservoirs traced to wild rodent populations across Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Scientists realized that plague was not merely an urban disease, but a zoonosis, rooted in deep ecological cycles. Human outbreaks were the visible tip of a much larger, hidden iceberg of infection among marmots, prairie dogs, gerbils, and rats. Managing plague would mean understanding and managing these reservoirs, not simply treating human victims. The breakthrough of antibiotics still lay decades in the future, but optimism was already rising. Sulfur drugs and early attempts at targeted therapies hinted that the bacterium might one day be tamed. laboratories refined vaccines, experimented with protective serums, and catalogued the genetic and immunological profile of the disease. By the mid-20th century, when streptomycin and tetracycline finally proved effective against Yersinia pestis, the long war that had begun in the 14th century tilted decisively in humanity's favour, and yet the revelations of 1894, 1930 carried their own sobering lesson. The discovery of the bacterium did not prevent the third pandemic from ravaging millions. The identification of fleas and rats as vectors did not eliminate outbreaks overnight. Knowledge did not translate instantly into salvation. Instead, science advanced, step by painful step, in the midst of suffering and death. The story of plague's modern revelation was not triumphalist but complicated, bound up with empire, inequality, and the limitations of human institutions. Still, the moment Yersin peered through his lens in Hong Kong marked a dividing line in history. For centuries, plague had been an inscrutable terror, a divine mystery, a black wind that no one could name. After 1894, it had a place on the charts of bacteriology, a pathogen that could be cultured, studied, and ultimately confronted. The long shadow of the Black Death had not disappeared, but at last, humanity could see the hand that cast it. In the silence of old plague pits, beneath layers of earth where entire parishes were lowered in haste, the dead have begun to speak again, not in words, but in fragments of DNA preserved inside their teeth, molecular time capsules sealed in enamel, waiting for centuries until science learned how to listen. Archaeologists working in London's East Smithfield Cemetery, a vast trench dug during the Black Death of 1348-49, carefully removed skulls from rows of hurried burials. From the pulp of molars, shielded from soil and decay, geneticists extracted tiny traces of Yersinia pestis. It was the same organism that Alexandre Yersin had identified in 1894, but now seen in its medieval form, its ancient genome painstakingly pieced together base by base. The revelation was astonishing. The bacterium that had killed so many could be resurrected, not in living form, but as digital code mapped across screens. These reconstructions allowed scientists to compare strains from different times and places, building phylogenetic trees that revealed family histories of the pathogen. Each genome was like a diary entry, noting where and when a lineage had travelled. From 14th century London to 16th century Marseille, from 15th century Russia to 18th century Germany, the DNA testified to how plague evolved, spread, and persisted. Suddenly, the Black Death was no longer just a human memory recorded in chronicles. It was a biological event written in the genes of a microbe. The findings confirmed that the medieval pandemic was caused by Y. pestis, silencing the last doubters who had argued for anthrax or viral hemorrhagic fevers. But they also deepened the mystery. When scientists compared medieval genomes to modern strains still circulating in wild rodent reservoirs, they found remarkable continuity. The killer had not needed dramatic mutations to trigger catastrophe. The organism responsible for the deaths of up to 200 million was fundamentally the same bacterium that still lurks today in marmots, on the Asian steppe, or prairie dogs in North America. What changed was not the microbe itself, but the ecological and social conditions that allowed it to erupt across continents. Phylogenetic studies showed branching patterns that mirrored history. A strain emerging from Central Asia around the 13th century gave rise to the lineage that swept into Europe. Another branch travelled into Africa, shaping outbreaks in Egypt and beyond. Later sublineages sparked the 17th century London plague, and the 18th century Marseille outbreak. Each divergence could be dated with approximate precision, aligning with trade networks, migrations, and wars. The genetic tree became a historical map, tracing plague's journey through time and space with a clarity no chronicle alone could provide. The work demanded extraordinary precision. Ancient DNA is fragmented, contaminated, and scarce. Laboratories had to be sealed, contamination controlled, every extraction double-checked. Yet again and again, teeth yielded their secrets. From skeletons in Kyrgyzstan dated to the 1330s, researchers identified Y. pestis strains older than the Black Death, suggesting a reservoir already simmering in Central Asia before the pandemic burst westward. From plague pits in Scandinavia, Germany, and France, genomes traced the disease's progression north and west, mapping the firestorm of 1347-51 across the continent. Each find added another data point to the grand narrative of a microscopic invader, moving along caravans, ships, and armies. The implications extended beyond history. By reconstructing how plague lineages spread and survived, scientists could better understand modern outbreaks. In Madagascar, where plague still emerges from rodent reservoirs, strains can be compared to their medieval cousins, revealing how the bacterium adapts or fails to adapt over centuries. Vaccine research, too, has drawn on the insights of ancient DNA, identifying which genes govern virulence and which may be targeted for neutralization. The graves of the dead thus became laboratories for protecting the living. But perhaps the most haunting revelations were temporal. Analysis showed that the Black Death was not just a single eruption, but the beginning of centuries of persistence. Medieval genomes indicated that the strain seeded itself into European rodent populations, re-emerging in later centuries to cause recurring outbreaks. The long plague that tormented Europe until the 18th century was, in part, the echo of that first arrival, sustained within hidden ecological niches. When outbreaks faded in the West, the DNA evidence suggested that it was not because the bacterium had disappeared, but because the human environment had changed, closing off the pathways that once allowed such devastation. The research also cast light backward, far before the 14th century. Genetic traces of Y. pestis have been discovered in skeletons from the Bronze Age, over 30 years earlier than the Black Death. These ancient strains lacked some of the virulence factors found in later forms, such as the flea-borne transmission mechanism. Yet even then, plague had already begun its long dance with humanity, shaping demographic shifts and perhaps contributing to great migrations in prehistory. The Black Death was thus one act in a much older drama, the climax of a relationship between microbe and host stretching across millennia. What emerges from this genetic archaeology is a paradox. The bacterium responsible for history's deadliest pandemic is both timeless and mutable, stable in its core identity, yet endlessly adaptable to new ecologies. Its DNA records a tale of continuity and change, of disasters unleashed not by radical mutations, but by the intricate interplay of environment, society, and chance. A flea's bite, a rat's stowaway journey in a grain ship, a city's crowded quarter. All these were as decisive as the genome itself. To look into the reconstructed genome of Yersinia pestis is to gaze into the eyes of a killer that has haunted humanity for more than 1,000 years, and to realize that it is still with us. The graves of London, the steppes of Kyrgyzstan, the ports of Marseille all whisper the same truth. The Black Death was never just a medieval nightmare locked in the past. It was a biological event whose echoes continue, and whose story is still being written in the genes of a microbe preserved inside ancient teeth. How does one begin to grasp a number as vast as 200 million? It is a figure so large that it strains imagination, dwarfing wars, earthquakes, and famines, folding entire generations into silence. Yet, the Black Death and its centuries of recurrences truly did kill, on that order of scale, reshaping humanity itself. To reach such a number requires a careful synthesis of evidence scattered across Europe, the Middle East and North Africa, Central Asia and East Asia, each region offering fragments of mortality registers, chronicles, archaeological data, and demographic reconstructions. The difficulty is not only in finding the sources, but in making them speak across cultures and centuries, harmonizing their whispers into a single, terrible chorus. Europe provides the most abundant evidence, if only because literacy and bureaucratic structures were more developed there. Parish registers, manorial rolls, and civic account books show staggering losses. 30 to 60% of populations in many regions between 1,347 and 1,351. In England alone, manorial court records show villages abandoned, fields untilled, rents unpaid because the tenants were gone. In Italy, tax registers reveal cities like Florence cut nearly in half. France, the Low Countries, the Holy Roman Empire, all endured comparable scything. From these data points, historians estimate that perhaps 50 million Europeans died during the initial Black Death wave, out of a population of roughly 80 million. Yet even this is only the beginning. Across the Mediterranean and into the Islamic world, the devastation was just as acute, though less well documented. Cairo, one of the largest cities on earth in the 14th century, lost so many that Ibn Khaldun, whose own parents perished, wrote that an entire civilization seemed to have withered. In Damascus, chroniclers counted hundreds dying each day, the mosques echoing with funeral prayers. Baghdad, already diminished from Mongol conquest, was struck again, and so were the caravan routes linking Persia, the Caucasus, and the Arabian Peninsula. While exact numbers cannot be pinned down, modern reconstructions suggest that the Middle East and North Africa together may have lost 20 to 25 million people in the 14th century's first pandemic wave. Further east, the demographic picture grows murkier but no less grim. China, under the Yuan dynasty, had already been stressed by rebellion, famine, and ecological crisis. Outbreaks flared in Hebei, along caravan towns in Gansu, and in port cities, with connections to Southeast Asia. By the time the Ming dynasty emerged from the Yuan's collapse, vast regions of the north had seen villages depopulated and agricultural production disrupted. Scholars debate the scale. Some argue the pandemic accelerated the Yuan fall, but was not decisive. Others see it as catastrophic in its own right. Estimates of deaths in China range from 25 to 50 million, depending on assumptions about population baselines and survival rates. What is certain is that plague carved through the world's largest state, with the same implacable hand that scythed Europe. In Central Asia and the steppe lands, the trail is fainter still. Excavations in Kyrgyzstan reveal plague DNA in skeletons dated to the 1330s, perhaps the spark of the wider conflagration. Caravan hubs and nomadic encampments along the Silk Road endured outbreaks, but records are scarce, their voices muffled by the passage of time. What can be inferred is that mortality must have been significant, disrupting trade flows and weakening Mongol successor states just as plague undercut dynasties elsewhere. Perhaps 10 to 15 million lives were lost in this vast interior zone. though no one will ever know the true number. The multiplicative effect of successive waves makes the overall toll so immense. The Black Death of 1347-51 was only the opening strike. Plague returned in 1361, in the so-called pestilence of children, then again in the 1370s, the 1390s, and at intervals through the 15th and 16th centuries. Each wave struck populations already weakened, trimming new generations before they could fully replace the dead. In some towns, families that had rebuilt after the first blow found themselves extinguished in the second or third. Over centuries, the cumulative attrition created demographic valleys from which recovery was agonizingly slow. Modern historians use models to estimate totals. Starting with known population baselines, Europe around 80 million in 1300, China perhaps 125 million, the Islamic world another 80 million. They calculate mortality rates based on regional evidence, then extend these to undercounted areas. Confidence intervals are wide. Was it 75 million, 120 million, or 200 million? Yet even at the lowest estimates, the pandemic remains the deadliest catastrophe in recorded history. At the upper bound, it represents nearly 1 in every 3 humans alive at the time, extinguished within a century. Why such variation in estimates? Because evidence is patchy and survival uneven. Cities often recorded their losses better than the countryside, yet rural areas may have been equally or more devastated. In some places, chroniclers exaggerated for dramatic effect, while in others, the trauma was so deep that silence prevailed. Archaeology fills some gaps, as mass graves testify to scale, but bones alone cannot yield precise counts. The truth lies somewhere between the registers, the pits, and the chronicles. An immense mortality, uneven but global, stitched together through careful reconstruction. What is striking is how interconnected the suffering was. The pestilence did not respect boundaries. From the steppes of Central Asia to the valleys of England, from Cairo's minarets to China's walled towns, the same bacillus travelled, carried in the fur of rats and the guts of fleas, leaping from caravan to ship, from port to hinterland. The world of the 14th century, linked by trade, empire, and pilgrimage, became the stage for the first truly global biological disaster. Each region endured its own version of the calamity, but the pattern, sudden mortality, social collapse, religious crisis, economic upheaval was echoed across continents. To say 200 million is not to claim exactitude, but to acknowledge scale. The Black Death was not a storm that passed once and was gone. It was a climate of death, returning again and again, reshaping societies for generations. Numbers, however imprecise, give a sense of magnitude, but the human reality is felt in the silences of abandoned villages, the empty places in family trees, the way entire crafts, lineages, and traditions disappeared. A number can be debated. What cannot be denied is that the world that emerged from the second plague pandemic was a different world altogether, smaller in people, but transformed in possibility. The enormity of 200 million is thus not just a statistic. It is the weight of humanity's most profound mortality crisis, carried across time by bones, chronicles, and now, by the genetic fingerprints of the microbe itself. It is the reminder that a bacterium, invisible to the eye, once came close to remaking the human story entirely, and that its shadow still lingers on the edges of history. The world of the 14th century seems impossibly distant. Its stone walls, candlelit streets, and horse-drawn carts a universe apart from our age of satellites and global networks. Yet the lessons of the Black Death remain uncannily alive, echoing through the corridors of modern pandemics. Then, as now, people confronted a foe they could not see, a disease that moved faster than their explanations, a crisis that tested both institutions and the bonds of community. The core dilemmas of plague surveillance, quarantine, communication, and trust remain as pressing in the 21st century as they were when bells tolled for the dead in medieval towns. Surveillance begins with the simple question: how do we know what is happening? In the 14th century, rulers and city councils relied on rumour, chroniclers, and the visible swelling of mortality. Bells ringing day and night, corpse wagons clattering through narrow lanes, the sudden closure of markets, all were signals, but always after the fact. Today, we have molecular diagnostics, international reporting networks, and real-time dashboards. Yet even with these tools, pandemics have shown how difficult it remains to see clearly in the fog of an unfolding crisis. Just as medieval cities underestimated the speed of contagion, modern states have faltered in recognizing the scope of new outbreaks until they were already racing beyond control. The past reminds us that speed of detection can mean the difference between a contained spark and a global conflagration. Quarantine was one of the Black Death's most enduring inventions, and its lessons continue to reverberate. Ragusa's 40-day isolation for arriving ships became the template for state-managed containment. It was a blunt tool, costly for trade and burdensome for travellers. Yet it saved lives. Modern equivalents, travel bans, isolation orders, lockdowns carry the same tension between safety and liberty. People bridle at restrictions, merchants protest, lost profit, and political leaders must weigh the fury of the present against the peril of the unseen. The medieval precedent demonstrates that such measures work, but only when they are applied consistently, transparently, and with public buy-in. A quarantine imposed by decree, but ignored in practice, achieves nothing but resentment. The effectiveness of isolation, whether in 1348 or in 2020, depends on trust between rulers and the ruled. Communication in plague time is never neutral. In the medieval world, sermons thundered of divine wrath, while rumours accused minorities of poisoning wells. Letters carried stories of entire towns perished. Oral tales inflated horrors until they became almost mythic. Today, we live in a world where news travels at the speed of light, but the challenges of clarity remain. Misinformation, conspiracies, and scapegoating persist with remarkable continuity. The lesson of the past is that communication must not only inform, but also reassure, acknowledge suffering without fueling panic, and offer guidance without sowing division. In moments of collective vulnerability, words are as consequential as medicine. Trust is the hardest and most essential lesson. In the 14th century, trust in institutions often collapsed under the weight of mass death. Clergy died in droves, physicians failed, rulers fled their capitals, and ordinary people turned to desperate alternatives: flagellants, charms, violence against scapegoats. When trust evaporated, society fractured, and suffering deepened. In our own era, trust remains the fragile hinge on which public health swings. Vaccines, mandates, distancing measures all rely less on scientific possibility than on collective willingness. Without trust, the best tools falter. With trust, even limited resources can be marshalled into resilience. Modern pandemics have shown how quickly freedom and public health come into tension. The individual's right to move, work, and gather collides with the collective need to contain contagion. Medieval rulers did not speak in the language of rights, but they too faced resistance when markets were shut or when entire households were locked inside with the sick. Then as now, the balancing act is delicate, and there are no perfect answers. The lesson of the plague is that societies must constantly renegotiate this balance, recognizing that safety without freedom can breed tyranny, but freedom without responsibility can bring ruin. The Black Death also offers subtler lessons about inequality, resilience, and memory. In the 14th century, the poor suffered disproportionately, crowded in unsanitary quarters, lacking means to flee. They bore the brunt of contagion, yet afterward they sometimes found unexpected leverage, as labour shortages forced elites to bargain. Modern crises, too, reveal that pandemics are never equalizers. They expose and widen existing fractures. The question is whether societies choose to let those inequalities harden, or whether they seize the disruption as a chance to reimagine fairer systems. Memory is its own kind of vaccine. Europe lived in the shadow of the Black Death for centuries. Its art, literature, and institutions shaped by what it had endured. The dead spoke through Boccaccio's stories, through the grim skeletal dances on cathedral walls, through the laws of quarantine and the rhythms of prayer. Memory guided action when new outbreaks appeared, reminding communities what had worked and what had failed. Today, memory is equally vital. Forgetfulness breeds complacency, and complacency invites repetition. To study the Black Death is not antiquarian curiosity, it is an act of preparation. At its heart, the lesson is humbling. Humanity does not master nature, it negotiates with it. The plague bacterium, invisible until the late 19th century, shaped entire civilizations before science could even give it a name. The story of 200 million dead is a story of limits of how fragile our systems of trade, faith, and government can be when confronted with a microscopic adversary. But it is also a story of survival. Communities did endure, adapted, and even transformed, laying the groundwork for the modern world. The lesson is not despair, but vigilance. That vigilance must be scientific, political, and moral. From the corpse wagons of medieval Europe to the refrigerated trucks of modern cities, from the sermons of doomsayers to the press conferences of public health officials, the same themes repeat: surveillance, quarantine, communication, and trust. These are the ancient tools of pandemic response, sharpened or dulled by how societies choose to wield them. Freedom and safety, fear and solidarity, despair and resilience all must be held in tension, then as now. The Black Death is not merely history. It is a mirror. When we look into it, we see our own time reflected, with all its hopes and failures, its struggles and possibilities. In the stillness that followed the storm, the world that had known the Black Death was not the same world that emerged from its shadow. Out of the tolling bells and emptied villages, from the rows of mass graves and the silence of abandoned farms, new shapes of society began to form. What had seemed like the end of days slowly revealed itself to be a hinge of history. Feudal bonds, once thought eternal, cracked under the pressure of loss. Labourers who had survived suddenly found their work more valuable than their masters' titles. The rigid hierarchy of medieval life bent and shifted, not through ideology, but through necessity. From England to the Rhineland, from Florence to Flanders, wages rose, demands were made, and new freedoms were won. Land that had lain fallow became available to tenants. Serfdom, though not vanquished everywhere, began its long retreat. The plague, indiscriminate in its killing, had redistributed power among the living. States, too, were forced to evolve. The crisis had revealed the limits of medieval governance, where city councils and kings alike had flailed against an enemy they could neither see nor stop. Out of that helplessness grew new capacities: quarantine, health boards, and the first stirrings of public health administration emerged, creating a precedent for state power over bodies and borders. Tax records show kingdoms scrambling to rebuild revenue from shattered populations, while rulers discovered that legitimacy rested not only on divine right, but also on the ability to protect their subjects from catastrophe. The plague forged stronger states, more intrusive and more capable, setting in motion patterns of governance that would shape the modern age. Culture bore the imprint of mortality. The images of skeletons dancing through the streets, the macabre processions painted on church walls, and the grim verses of poets all testified to a society haunted by death. Yet from this darkness came new currents of thought. Art and literature shifted, embracing realism, emotion, and human frailty. The seeds of Renaissance humanism found fertile ground in a generation that had seen how fragile human life could be, and how urgently it demanded to be understood. The certainty of salvation through institutions weakened, replaced by a more personal reckoning with God, by new devotions, new confraternities, and eventually, reformist movements that would challenge the very foundations of Christendom. Science, too, changed course in the plague's wake. Medicine had failed spectacularly, bound in the chains of humours and miasma, powerless before the swellings and fevers. That failure planted doubt, but also curiosity, the search for better knowledge, for explanations rooted not only in scripture, but in observation, began to take deeper root. Apothecaries compiled herbals, physicians questioned ancient authorities, and the slow, faltering steps toward empirical science found urgency in the memory of catastrophe. Though centuries would pass before microbes were glimpsed under a lens, the hunger to understand, rather than simply to pray, grew sharper with every recurrence of pestilence. Economies rebalanced, consumption patterns changed as survivors enjoyed more land, more food, and greater choice. Diets improved. Meat and dairy became more common, and guilds opened to newcomers who filled the gaps left by the dead. Urban rebirth followed decline, with cities like Florence, Venice, and London re-emerging not diminished but transformed. New wealth from trade, spurred by labour shifts and market opportunities, fueled architecture, art, and commerce. Even catastrophe could not freeze the dynamism of human societies. Instead, it redirected their currents into channels that would shape the centuries to come. Memory ensured the plague never truly ended. Chronicles, sermons, poems, and monuments carried its imprint. Families who traced their lineage through survivors told stories of the time when whole streets vanished. Communities remembered the silence of bells too numerous to toll. These memories, carved into culture, created vigilance for generations. Every new outbreak was seen through the lens of the Black Death. Every epidemic measured against it. The trauma of those years became a template for imagining disaster, a story retold each time the world faced sickness again. The Black Death had begun with a flea on a rat, with a bacterium invisible to the eye, with the mundane interactions of rodents and men along the arteries of trade. Yet, from that microscopic beginning, unfurled revolutions in labour, in governance, in thought, and in belief. The feudal world cracked, the modern world stirred. Out of horror came resilience, out of collapse came renewal. Humanity's fragility had been laid bare, but so too had its astonishing capacity to adapt. The world the plague made was poorer in lives, but richer in lessons, and those lessons still whisper across the centuries, reminding us that even in the face of devastation, people endure, transform, and begin again.